And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. What a fantastic crowd we have out there already tonight in the Ideas Room. And of course, tonight I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And I'm just adjusting some levels there for everybody. And I got to tell you, tonight is a very exciting episode. Been working, trying to draw in so many of the mystery school connections for this one. But of course, everything that's been going on is all about this balloon.
Mm-hmm.
And we've been watching it all week and observing that situation. So I want to say a few things about that right at the outset. But before I do, I'm going to announce the title for tonight's show. This is X Series episode 146, and we're dealing tonight with the mysteries of the Golden Dawn. Now, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn is one of the premier Western initiatory mystery schools. It showed up in 1888 of all dates. And right in the midst of that explosion of mystical information that hit every continent. And it was a huge unloading, a discharge of some of the most vital and electrifying information across continents, major cities, and centers of learning that really transformed the culture dramatically. And I still feel that our deep analysis of it can help us to understand how it rivets into this century and how they were trying to sort of prepare us at the time. But when we get around the Golden Dawn, we are dealing with tons of controversy, tons of magic, and some of the practitioners who went off to do magic with a K. So this is going to get us into ceremonial magic. It's going to get us into this huge explosion of the Golden Dawn that happened also in the 60s and 70s by major music artists and actresses and actors and directors and the whole kind of celebrity thing around it. And then the strange background that we have about the Golden Dawn, including the fact that even the tarot cards that we refer to now are based largely on the interpretations directly from the school there of the Golden Dawn. So this is going to open up a great deal tonight, including some of their own initiatory secrets and how much of that came out, how much of it was leaked, and how much of it is just a facade of what was leaked, and that they kept the real information that moves in other traditions, and who picked up on those traditions, including people like Dion Fortune and W.B. Yeats and so many others, including Alice in Wonderland. So now we feel right at home because Alice in Wonderland describes our existence these days. But it's great to have so many of you out there. I'm going to remind you right now that in the second part of tonight's program, we are going to be taking your questions on all of this, and Miss Olivia is going to put those together as we speak. So how's it going out there?
Going great. Everybody wants to talk about the balloon, so let's get to
it. Well, I was going to say, how's the weather out there? But we know it's been below zero, which is pretty exceptional. Here's the thing about the so-called surveillance balloon coming from China. This thing presumably came over from Alaska and, through Canada and then to the United States, was widely reported once it hit Montana. And we got a lot of reports of people tracking it on their phone and all the rest of it. So there's been a lot of squirrely language out of the DOD and the administration on this. I can tell you right away that the entire story around the balloon as it's been presented is completely unrealistic and untrue. So I don't know exactly why they've put this on, but I can certainly guess based on a few things that have gone on. I printed out a few things about this balloon. Look, we have air defense systems that have been in place in the United States since World War I. And after World War II, they heightened dramatically. During the Cold War, they heightened ultimately. And then by the time you get to 9/11, forget it, right? The whole thing about those airliners being taken over and stuff doesn't make any sense based on the defenses that we had either. So this story that this could just float in and that we just observed it and couldn't stop it because, if we destroyed it, it might cause damage on the ground. Well, anyone who lives, in that part of Canada that it was traveling in, or even before when it was in Alaska, I mean, it wasn't going to damage anybody's home or anything if you took it down. So that excuse is beyond absurd. I want to point out, just based on actual framework and legal references, that as a matter of international law, you can't float a balloon over somebody's territory. When those types of things happen, we get into situations, for example, like during the Cold War, when Khrushchev shot down our U-2. It heightens the whole tension around war, et cetera. So protocols were built in dramatically after those things happened. In 1945, a Japanese balloon bomb killed 6 Americans, 5 of them children, in Oregon. This is on the record. That's Smithsonian. And this only came out years later, of course. But as a result of the Japanese balloon bombs that they sailed over here, and they did a number of them, and a lot of them didn't do damage because they went off course. There are tons of pictures of these things, and they built in protocols for balloons coming in. And it said, if anybody's flying a balloon, 1, we take it out, and 2, we identify its origin, and we tell the people who sent it over, if you send any more over, it's an act of war. So that's been in place since 1945. Okay, so we're looking now 75 years later. This isn't something that would just happen and we would just let go over, this thing is flying over Missouri and stuff. So something very strange about it. There's a book that details all of these attacks and the protocols that we built upon after the fact of World War II, called Japan's World War II Balloon Bomb Attacks on North America. They're very well detailed. We've had them. We developed protocols as a result of them. So the surveillance balloon from China, the story around it and how we dealt with it doesn't make any sense. So finally, when it gets past in North Carolina, we blow it up. As it's heading, cruising on out into the hot zone. I don't know. There's dramatic protocol. This one, a faulty ballast dropping mechanism will cause the balloon to land without dropping its bomb near Tremonton, Utah, February of 1945. We're at war with the Japanese. I'm telling you, we developed all kinds of protocols around dangerous balloons way back then. So this idea of this thing just sailing over the United States and like, oh, we just noticed it, and oh, we were observing it, never happened in a million years. So that's a really big problem, because we're not getting the real story from them. Now, as a result of this, they canceled the summit with the Secretary of State. It's not such a big deal, but now we're getting warnings from China like, oh, you shouldn't have shot down our balloon. That's also weird. And then the Pentagon said, well, actually, there's another balloon, and it's over South America. So all of this activity is very strange. And some of it, the part about the balloon going across America was done with our help, because I just explained the protocols. So as an act of war, you would send a balloon over somebody's territory. So, and they were like, oh, well, we've seen, in the Washington Post is like, well, it's happened before, there's a balloon over Hawaii. Well, Hawaii is pretty far away from the American mainland. It's a part of the United States for sure. But, it's out there, and you can see the Pacific piece there. If they're doing things out in the Pacific on behalf of China, then they might, then there's a possibility it would go over Hawaii. But even that seems ridiculous. But the idea that that thing would just float over here on its own is absurd, and our reaction has been absurd. So we have to really take that into consideration. Whatever it is that they're up to in balloon land, one, they're doing it with our consent on some level. And that's the disturbing part, I guess, in all this. The other part, China's little bombast about this, I don't know. The whole thing seems like a weird setup. And then we have Biden going to Camp David. That's weird too. So as if he anticipated a crisis, right? So I think we have to really look at this from a few different levels and say to ourselves, where do we go, in terms of interpreting this? And what are they trying to set up in terms of turning our attention up to the skies? So that becomes maybe a crucial piece for us to look at in relation to this. In terms of international law, it's not done. And, any idea that this was an off-course balloon is also nonsense. The other thing is that, we already had a set series of tensions with China. So, and they know that we're having a lot of tensions with Russia. So they wouldn't, this wouldn't happen. And also, if it did happen that way, then they would have stopped it by the time it was in Alaska, because there's all this time to go across Canada and all the rest, and they would have noticed it. Look, they can read a license plate underground in Russia with our satellites here. And one of the satellites that goes, it's right in New England. And that thing can read it in Russia. Okay. So if this thing is just sailing across Alaska and Canada, then they saw it. And also the people who sent it knew it was off course, if that was the story. So both of those are lies. And so it presents a problem about what is the intent here. And the immediate response, of course, should have been to shoot it down. So on our side, we allowed it. That's weird too. And Canada allowed it, so the whole setup for it doesn't make any sense. That's not a logical setup. And so if they were at a Pentagon press conference, my question would be, why did you breach every international normal protocol when you saw this balloon? By the way, the guy that we have operating NORAD is the same guy who would be the commander of the continuity of government, in the event of an emergency. So that guy, his whole job and his whole staff's job is to monitor things that are in space and in the atmosphere around America. So they would have known about this way before. So that's weird. And then the final addition of weirdness on this is Malmstrom Air Force Base. Okay, so as I pointed out, the commander now of Space Force, who they graduated up last summer, General Chance, he served for a decade in Malmstrom, and now he's the Space Force commander. So you've got the COG commander, NORAD, and he has a big history with the 509th, which is the same group as the Roswell bomb squad from 1947 that found the wreckage of a weather balloon, right? So this is very strange, of course, because there's a UFO connection, in fact, with the COG commander who's commanding NORAD now. And then we also have a UFO connection with the Malmstrom Air Force Space Commander. And then you get a balloon, which goes right over. And I'm still looking for the exact trail map of this thing, but the idea that it got to Missouri, so if you go Montana, Missouri to Carolinas, it had that whole line. So something very unique, I would say, about the trajectory involved, and then the signature of these two UFO events just hanging out there. So I would say that there's, with General Van Herk, who is the COG NORAD commander, and he's the Northcom commander. He gets all three titles. The fact that he's part of the 509th, and then the fact also that we're dealing with this other general who is the Space Force commander, and he's got the whole Maelstrom background, which is where this thing was zooming around. It opens up a lot of issues, but fundamentally and categorically on the news side, if somebody were just to look at it as a straight up news story, the idea that they would let a balloon just go sailing across America in these kind of tense periods of time when people are like making nuclear threats on the other side of the world, it just would never happen. And so we need to keep that in mind in terms of, but we're going to be keeping a very close look on this as well. And we know, presumably, they blew it up now once it already did its job, right? Because it's sending that stuff back. It doesn't need to actually physically land. It's probably just communicating all the information as it gets it. So this is what we're talking about. And so with that in mind, the only thing we can do is to continue to press the administration to give us the real story on it when it comes down to it. And I would look for more sky incidents in relation to this, because for me, it's part of a pattern of whatever it is they're setting up here. And hopefully it's, it becomes something that we get ahead of and doesn't really, go for the whole surprise attack type situation, because there certainly is strange things about it. And when we get into EMPs and things of this nature, there are people running over a cliff being like, it's an EMP attack. No, but it's strange. This is the way that you would get intel for how to bomb targets. You'd send a balloon over. But also in the case of China, they know when they send this thing over that we're going to pick it up. So that's weird too. The whole thing is weird on both sides. So therefore, whatever it is, it's a joint activity. So let's keep that in mind. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 146. Tonight, we're going deep on the Golden Dawn. Yes, Aleister Crowley is in there as well. And we're also looking at MacGregor Mathers and his very interesting other names, including Little, and how that has a ring to it, because after all, MacGregor was related to Alice Little, who was the inspiration, as it were, for Alice in Wonderland. We're going to see how those two connect and how this is a dramatic earthquake back in the 19th century. We're also, I want to remind everyone before we go any further, especially if you're new, to sign up for our newsletter. And this is a free newsletter, and it's at darkjournalist.com. Basically keeps you up to date on all the things that we have coming up for you, including the dramatic X series shows that we have coming up, leading up to the 5-year anniversary of the X series sometime later in March. Some incredible, and I mean incredible, interviews coming up this month and next month, and some that are just going to blow you away. But we're, including Gigi Young, Joseph Farrell, Catherine Fitz, and others. It's just going to be an incredible schedule for it, and it keeps you up to date for any events or documentaries or things that we have coming up later this year. Make sure that you're part of the newsletter. Stand up and be counted for that. And like I said, we're going to be taking your questions in part 2 of tonight's program. We'll go a few hours tonight. Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Chris Saul says the balloon is an EMP test run.
Yeah. I would say that. I mean, it certainly could be. It could be UFO recon as well. But these official stories, it's interesting to me. At one point, the Pentagon official who was giving the press conference, he was like, well, they're like, can't you give us more information? He's like, well, look up, what kind of an answer is that? Where were these people going with this? I would also say that their general demeanor has been like, don't ask us about it. And Stepford Biden was like, oh, I wanted to shoot it down earlier, but my generals told me no. The whole thing has a weird flavor to it. On day one, I will say Trump said shoot it down, but there were a number of people who were saying shoot it down because they know the history behind these things. And, you just do not have it. Yeah, what do you got?
Mama Sabi W says they want us to look up now.
Right, exactly. And, it's interesting too, because there was a really low moment for the UFO field that happened this week. And I'll get to this just before we start. But I was thinking about this because I was thinking as I was reading about these esoteric groups that clawed, some of them were really on the right track and got taken down. Others had incredible clashes. And I was thinking about these different groups and how they were supposed to really be bringing forward this new enlightenment and everything. And some of them, even the best of them, like Steiner's organization and Gurdjieff's and stuff, they had some great internal struggles. But these other groups, Golden Dawn, forget it. They're just shooting at each other. What's fascinating to me, though, is I was thinking about the UFO field and how much at a certain point it was providing in terms of, upgrading people's knowledge about the subject and just giving us a better idea and a better handle around, what's in our skies, what are these abductions related to, and all the rest. And then we got all the funny business with the secret space program, people running away with a false version of that when it was a very true, field of learning, which included scientific, economic, and just really great information. So first you had a marketing commercialization around that. And then you had the whole TTSA thing, which we reported on dramatically on this show, really exposing the intelligence ties around it and how dangerous a program like that is when you put the CIA in charge of the UFO file, and then they come out and they say, here's our CIA organization that's going to run UFO reports. And then you make that as part of a government machine to fuel a war machine, basically to fight aliens and, to present the whole narrative, etc. So I was thinking of what a low point we had hit in terms of that, and how the whole UFO file aspect is so much more interesting. The field is so much more interesting. The contact stories are so much more interesting than anything like what the CIA is putting out there, and how the researchers who went along with that really let their audience down. Well, I got a great example of that this week. This, I think, lower than Corey Good, lower than TTSA. This is a low, low moment. You ready? This is a picture of a filmmaker, UFO enthusiast, Jeremy Corbell. He's not a UFO expert and he's not a journalist, with George Knapp, and they're at CNN. And Corbell puts a tweet out and he says, as journalists, this is weird again, because Corbell is not. He's a UFO enthusiast. He was a groundskeeper before he was a UFO enthusiast. So going to have to explain that one to me. George Knapp and I are just reporting the news. Are you ready? CNN wants to get to the bottom of it all regarding UAP. They're asking the big questions to the Pentagon now. I mean, that's what we're talking about. That's where the UFO field. They're saluting CNN, the biggest disinformation artists on the planet, and saying they want the truth, And in the meantime, they're like, that Pentagon has to give us answers, because all the CIA people that we're working with need answers. I mean, they're all in the government. What are you talking about? So that's a low, and I don't know, that whole circus and the marketing trip that those people are on, or that a bunch of other researchers jump onto, it doesn't concern me. It's their own weird freak show. But I will say this, in terms of somebody as just somebody who's observing the field and been in it, and, read the books and have met the people, I spent all this time with Jim Marrs, Stanton Friedman, the late John Mack. These are the people who built the foundation for human understanding around this, and to see it just bottom out into this thing is not good. And I think what we need is a very invigorated UFO file research field that has nothing to do with the horse circus show that the CIA came up with, and now CNN is trying to bamboozle everybody with. CNN is literally the biggest liar network on the planet. I don't think there's anybody worse. And so, the idea that they're going to come up with the UFO file. In fact, they made a documentary with Elizondo, and Elizondo's star had fallen so far because of all of his weird statements and fights and stuff that they canceled the documentary. So I guess this is their new piece, is to come up with something with Knapp and Corbell. And I don't care about Corbell. What's interesting is Knapp, who has, I've talked to Knapp, and, I know him to a point to understand that he understands, a lot about this behind the scenes. So for him to, get to a point of going along with this, it's disturbing. And I would also say that somebody like Knapp has the background, in the 90s of putting together, really doing hardcore work on this and making it interesting, I think, getting good stories. So once somebody like that got involved with promoting CIA, Elizondo, and people of this ilk, and then everybody else went along with that, it derailed the field. So when I'm reading about these esoteric sects like Golden Dawn and the things that went wrong, I'm looking at the UFO field and I'm like, whoa, it feels like the same types of forces running this thing into the ground. And I'm going to show just how promising the Golden Dawn was at its outset, and how much of a spiral that was. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 146. It is the Golden Dawn mystery, the Hermetic order of the Golden Dawn, all the ceremonial magic, so many of the things that we take for granted in the magic field. Tarot cards, well, we've got the Rider-Waite deck. They're both deeply involved with Golden Dawn. We have the artist for the Rider-Waite deck, and she was part of the Golden Dawn. So much of what we turn to when we go just on a basic level, if a person is looking around for information on magic or, deep experiences, spiritual experiences around this whole esoteric field, Golden Dawn is responsible for a great foundation of this. And so what happens is there in the 19th century, we get these mystery schools, and they see all the things that we're going through. Like, they see what's coming up. And they get together and decide, you know, some of them are so hardcore about secrecy that even when things are printed out, like if something leaks out, they still won't talk about it. So, you know, even if it's out there, they'll still be like, you know, you're under initiation orders not to talk about it. So that's how hardcore the secrecy level can go in certain mystery school sects. Now, the mystery schools have gradations and they have centers. So there's an inside piece to this, and then you get outer circles and outer circles. But the fundamental way to think of the schools is to know that, you know, at the very heart of the mystery schools is this deep, ancient, esoteric series of orders. And then outside of that is something called lesser schools. And the lesser schools know a great deal of information. I think lesser is one of those titles that's just applied as a way to keep everyone humble because they know so much. But I would say they know maybe about half of what the deep core esoteric schools know. And then outside of that, you have arcane schools, which are very much what I just referenced, where they do everything by the book. So they maintain the information just exactly as it was. And there's a great deal, you know, it's like a library in a sense of deep knowledge, and it's still widely hidden from the public. The great thing about it is that it observes the rules, and it gives you that kind of sacred initiation engagement with it. The only problem with it is with the lesser schools and with the mystery schools, the tradition is building and is adapting itself to modern times, and the arcane information is there. It's almost like basic. I wouldn't even call it basic, but it's advanced training. But it's a kind of training that is on a particular level, and it doesn't allow for new influences. So, you know, even that is something that you don't get in the everyday run when it comes to mystery information. Then you get interest groups, and interest groups are private, and those are the types of things that we hear about. Somebody will hear something about a public group, and it's out of those public groups that all of these private individuals will create this magnetic center for a certain type of learning around the schools. So they're basically building magnetic center. When I sit down and pick up a book about anthroposophy or the Golden Dawn, it's resonating. You're creating a magnetic center to these types of ideas and working with them. There comes a point where you know, you look at the field and you say, how would I expand my knowledge on it? So but you know, basically you enter into a state of awareness once you start to study it, and so the rest kind of plays out however it's going to play out. Not everybody ends up joining a mystery school for sure. But it is important to note that the whole mystery tradition is something that goes all the way back to, you know, the Book of the Dead and the Egyptian mystery schools. But if you go further back, it goes back and priestess culture. Ah, the screen just blinked. Did you see that one?
I did. I noticed it.
Hopefully it's not the balloon on its way back. It's balloon revenge. So what I want to say when it comes to the mystery tradition, so we're both on the same page, there's a period where the mystery schools in Akhenaten's time, there's a very great challenge. And I would say this is the same challenge that played out in Atlantis between the Belial group and the Amelius group, where one group wants to hoard the mystery information and use it for dominating effects, and another group wants to move the culture forward. We see it play out over and over again. And in the case of Akhenaten, it was dramatic because Egypt was kind of the center of the world and the cultural movement at that period. And when he rejected the Amun gods and the whole religion around that and started the Aten, which is, you know, a sun disk, but it represents one god. It's a sun god. Introducing this monotheistic piece created a whole wave of mystery school activity, and they drove him out of power and removed his names from obelisks. We know in all the different Egyptian records, he was just wiped out. So, and Nefertiti was as well. There's just a few remnants that came about, and we were lucky enough to get our hands on them, including the fact that Tutankhamun was his son, and so when that was discovered, we had another whole window on that situation. But in terms of how the Egyptian mysteries play out, it is significant because you have a period there that's like an earthquake again, where this information goes underground. And then Pythagoras and all these other schools, there's a knowledge that's kept that relates to very ancient information regarding humanity. And it's built upon by individuals. And that at a certain point, the story of the mystery schools, if you study the public mystery schools like anthroposophy, theosophy, the Casey work, Gurdjieff, or whatever it happens to be, is that there's a group that maintains this. And they're, those schools consist of physical people, but at a certain point, it's an astral group. And they're in the etheric, and they are operating on a spiritual level, influencing physical activities. So we have to keep that in mind as we go tonight, because when we're looking at the spiritual aspect, you have to remember the antagonistic piece. So tonight, when we open up with Steiner and Theosophy and all this piece, you're coming right into the Golden Dawn and Crowley and Mathers and this whole piece, and how it gets derailed after starting off as just as promising as something like anthroposophy or theosophy. I also want to stress that it's probably crucial the way, we take it for granted maybe that some of these groups like anthroposophy was able to build off of theosophy and really have something that contributed to the culture and that we can work with now. Whereas the Golden Dawn, we have a lot to be thankful for with them, but they were derailed dramatically from what they were going to be. And again, there was movement inside those mystery schools to get this into the public, which is rare.
What was the name of the priestess school? That's what we were saying when we blinked out for a minute.
We went from Pythagoras.
That may have been it.
Yeah,
Okay.
that was, that's not a priestess school, but it is right after the Egyptian mystery tradition. You get the Pythagoras schools, and that's a later Egyptian period.
Karen Carpenter wanted to know, the mystery schools go back how far?
Oh, they go all the way back to Atlantis. I mean, at the advent of humanity, really. So the Atlantean story that Casey tells is that, those Amelia's group initiates and the priestesses kept the information and built these halls of records while we were in this incredible destruction pattern brought about by the technology in Atlantis, as well as weather and earth changes and things like that. So it wasn't just one thing. And the idea that, it was just an earthquake destroyed Atlantis, it's not going to fly. If you look at the mystery school tradition, they're telling you there's a reason, there's something that the Atlanteans did. And that is the misuse of this deeper information. I think that's going to be important. Steiner is interesting here when we start out with this, because he is somebody who was looking at the ground floor of all this around 1901. And he's seeing the advent of Golden Dawn and Theosophy, and he joins Theosophy, and he becomes a favorite among Theosophists in Germany, so much so that Annie Besant, who's taken over for Blavatsky, who's passed away, she says, look, just run the German Theosophical chapter, and that's a big chapter. So they really trusted Steiner dramatically. When we look at the period just preceding this, we're getting into a period where the mystery schools are trying dramatically to introduce these deeper themes as a way to prevent humanity from falling under the boot of scientific materialism and separating off, and like a huge cult of atheism taking over where they just worship the technology. And at the same time, the religions are going through a transformation because it seems like the message is old. Now, here's the thing that I understand about religions. The core principles are everlasting. But, if you have stories on top about shepherds and, Moses and things like that, once you hit the 19th century, it seems very backdated. So they're under threat as well. And also, a lot of how they have taught things becomes almost stale. It becomes rote for people. They're not really invigorated. So the mystery schools, who are connected directly to the religious spiritual traditions, they decide, we're going to let this out and invigorate everything, basically. But they also know that there are dangers involved, which is why they've kept the information in select hands for so many years. And they learned it the hard way. When we get around to Blavatsky, it's very interesting because Blavatsky's a trade-off by the mystery schools. They decide, after a lot of going back and forth and helping mediums out and creating this whole craze for spiritualism in America in the 1850s and 60s, that there's a battle going on between the schools about how much to let out. And then what's happening is there are all these mediums coming forward, and they are getting these messages about life after death and things of these nature. And inside the mystery schools, there's a battle taking place, because the idea is they wanted to inform the culture about the spiritual afterlife. But what's happening is the culture is saying, hey, the Summerland, life after death is exactly like life here. And this causes a big problem for what they want to do. Basically, they feel like they're giving out the wrong message. They're misleading people. And people are getting hung up on that and not about this whole other thing. And then there's reincarnation to consider and all these other pieces. So Blavatsky is dramatic in that she is able to bring all this information together. And she does in a book called Isis Unveiled. She founds the Theosophical Society with Emma Britton and Henry Olcott in 1875. And I think what's significant about her, and it's something that Steiner said, is that she had the mediumistic talents that the Egyptians and the Greeks had, and it hadn't been seen in a long, long time, the level that she had it. So she was able to enter into the spiritual realm and bring information and insights back with her. So when she puts out this information in the 1870s, it's an explosion inside the mystery schools, because many of them don't understand where she got it. So she attempts to join the American mystery schools, and those schools based on, basically in America, it's a crisscross that's going on between the political side and the mystery schools. They're wrapped up dramatically. According to Steiner, they in fact form a single entity, where when you enter into political agreements, the mystery schools are represented, both the right-hand side and the left-hand side. Although the right and left political parties don't, that's not what we're referring to. In the traditions around the mystery schools, the right-hand path are the group that's trying to move the culture forward. The left-hand path has gradations, but it is generally, a selfish movement. It's like the selfish wizard trying to accomplish things by magic. There's a really interesting, as I was doing this, I enjoy Dion Fortune's work so much, and she was somebody who was around in the aftermath of this in like the 40s, the 30s and the 40s. And she really understood it. She got it quite well. Here's a few things that I think that she refers to that give us an idea about how we can think of the formation of the mystery schools. Quote, this is from a book called Esoteric Orders. The great mystery schools have existed from the dawn of consciousness in the human race. They are neither fabrications or the imagination of the imagination frauds to dupe the superstitious, nor existent solely on the inner planes. Outside Europe, they have flourished unchecked for time immemorial. Revered and feared by the peoples they guided, sometimes fallen upon evil days as the degenerate voodoo schools of Africa. This is interesting because, there's a gigantic voodoo juju movement that spreads out among from Africa to all these different islands. So she's suggesting that's kind of a mystery school gone wrong. Sometimes retaining a noble tradition, as in certain parts of India and Chinese schools, but always accepted as a part of the racial life, just as are the monastic orders among ourselves. In Europe, however, the state religion, which should have been the custodian of the mysteries, became instead their prosecutor. Now, this is very interesting. This unhappy state of affairs came about owing to the political expediency placed upon men in high positions who did not hold high degrees in the mysteries. So you get these kind of backwards leaders giving us this. So she goes on to basically say that there's a difference between how you set up a right hand and a left hand initiate, although they both share the same type of knowledge. And this is part of the problem, because on the left hand side, we're going to find out tonight that somebody who operated on kind of all sides of this, Crowley, I'm going to show you an interesting Aleister Crowley tonight. Here's somebody who knew everything about the right-hand path and exercised the left-hand path. It's very tricky to consider. Okay, the groups and societies should be looked upon as outposts of the mysteries, and it is the aim of every true teacher to pass to his pupils through the hands as speedily as may be and send them on to the order where he himself received his training. So it is with the occultists. The great ones are not easy to find, and the ones that are accessible are either among the smaller fry or are guides to bring the seeker to the mystery schools where they themselves receive their training. So then she goes on to talk about lesser mysteries and fraternities and so on. But what we need to get from that is that once somebody goes down the course of getting into mystery knowledge, they take it upon themselves. So there's a certain amount the teachers can do for them, and there's a certain amount that the order does for them. But at a certain point, you're on your own. And so your discretion, what you do with the information, becomes very much a personal choice, a personal decision. You make the wrong choices, you wreak havoc. You make the right choices, and you accomplish the aim that you came for. That's going to come in handy when we think about all the things that happened with Samuel Little, MacGregor Mathers, and Golden Dawn, as we take a look at it here tonight on this special on the Golden Dawn Mysteries. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Just a great group of you out there tonight. And in the second half of tonight's program, I mentioned we're going to be taking your questions as well on all of this. Miss Olivia, before I go any further.
Najat Madri says, I've been waiting for this topic to come up because I am convinced that X is more than a steganography. Anything involving the letter X includes some kind of magic spell for control.
Wow. Well, that's really true. This whole idea about spells, we should really bring it down to earth, because everything on some level is a spell, right? So when somebody really wants something, there's a kind of a magnetism to that right off the bat. And so we all experience spells of one kind or another. When they got kind of massive communication and massive technology behind it, and then you had black magicians behind that, they were doing widespread group magic. And so, a lot of people would look back on it and say, well, it seemed like, during the Kennedy assassination or something, we were under a dark cloud, and people, would have these stories. Well, after 9/11, it just felt like there was some, very kind of evil thing in the air. And before that, Hitler, when we had World War II and people look back at that, it seems like the ultimate occult ritual in a sense. But these people, it's interesting to me because when you get to the mystery schools in the 19th century, this is before we get into the world wars. So there's information on the inside that, really bad time is coming in for humanity, and that these forces are getting unleashed. And it's almost like there's rapid activity to help humanity do battle with it. At a certain point, if you look at the information that comes out from 1875, say to 1925, a 50-year period, the whole thing around spirituality, mystery traditions, reincarnation, psychic activity, it's all out there. Suddenly Atlantis is, a top object of study for people around esoteric information. So that's new. I mean, there were things like this, for sure. And we had periods that this harkens back to, like John Dee and people like that. But, there's a big cutoff there at a certain point. And then it seems like there's an incredible upturn of activity right there in that period. And then there's a setup period beforehand where we get this incredible mediumistic craze. And that's the mystery schools experimenting with certain individuals and bringing them public and saying, how do people accept information like this? So, in some sense, we have individual inspiration. These are people fulfilling their karma, their destiny by coming forward. But on the other hand, they're being helped along by this group. And figuring out who the groups are is very interesting. But we have public schools to help us. If you go back in the 14th century, out of the blue, all of these strange reports were coming out about the Rosicrucians, and that there's a secret ancient group that's coming forward with information, giving us a new enlightenment. It's an echo. There's a school there that is ready, and they're getting their message out through different people. And in order to do it properly and avoid persecution, it has to be done through groups and individuals in a particular fashion. So I think that we want to keep that in mind as we go, which is why when you get to Golden Dawn, who becomes controversial almost from day one, but they have some incredible individuals attracted to it right off the bat. Now, Golden Dawn directly relates to this show in a sense, because this is the X steganography series, and it's all about steganography that I observed when I was looking originally into technology issues about advanced technology programs that would disappear. And all of these X designations, I started to realize, became associated with projects and how to track projects, and were a kind of steganography hiding in plain sight for those who knew, the initiates who knew. When I took it back further in time, I started to find the X steganography through things like theosophy. And if you went further back into Rosicrucian medieval times, and then you go back to the Pythagoras schools, Akhenaten, the Mayan, the whole thing, the X steganography was there. So St. Andrew's Cross, just showing up over and over again in history, and not with any random quality. This is something that was placed in different spots so that these initiates would realize when something came forward like this. In the middle of studying about steganography, I ran across someone who's referred to as the father of steganography. It's Johannes Trithemius, who was an abbot in the 16th century in Germany. And he has a very interesting story, and it's really where the Golden Dawn story comes from as well, because we're going to find that the things that he hid, they're going to rediscover some 300 years later. Trithemius was young and inspired, and has a very strange history of really deep esoteric spirituality. So, he was traveling. Some of the background on him, just like the most basic bioactivity. Traveling from the university to his hometown in 1482, he was surprised by a snowstorm and took refuge in a Benedictine abbey. He decided to stay and was elected abbot in 1483 at the age of 21. Now, this is odd too. His age, the way he came there, there's something working in the background there.
Wasn't it just like a year later he becomes the abbot?
Yeah, he lands there when he's 20 and then he turns 21.
That's crazy.
Trithemius wrote extensively as a historian, starting with a chronicle of Sponheim and culminating in a 2-volume work on the history of the abbey. His work was distinguished by mastery of the Latin language. Now, they recognize something special about him, and he's given this incredible position and access to all of these sacred materials and sacred books. Now, what happens with him, he becomes what they call a famous builder of libraries for them. And in this process, somewhere along the line, he learns all about magical incantations and ceremonial magic. And when he goes to perform it, he finds that he's unusually good at it. And he realizes that he wants to write a book about these magical experiences where, there are holy entities and there's all these different things happening with him. But he also realizes that the people inside the church, if he lets this out, he will become persecuted. So he decides to utilize his knowledge to develop a steganography system. But in fact, what he draws upon and what he says is it's the Greeks actually had the best version of steganography. And he would just describe it simply as a page within a page. And there's a difference. There was all kinds of cryptography and things along this line. The difference with steganography is it's always hidden in plain sight. It's something that's out there in the open that somebody, if they looked at it who wasn't initiated, wouldn't know what it was. And there's a number of examples of it. And by the time we get to Alice in Wonderland, that's a steganographic book. So Trithemius puts out these different books eventually. This is what we get. He actually describes the system of steganography, and he uses these books as a way to promote the magical incantations and things and the different rites and rituals. And he puts out some remarkable information, but some of it isn't published till substantially after his death. This is a picture of him as a younger man. And well, I mean, I say younger there because he's younger than some of the older shots we have of him with no beard and gray hair. But what happens is the scrolls that he puts away dealing with ceremonial magic kind of go through this process where they're hidden away. And then there's a couple of researchers who will form the foundation of the Golden Dawn. And basically the story is going to go that in an antique shop, they're going to run across these scrolls that he secreted away. And the newly ciphered documents provide the basic structure of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. They're written in English from right to left using a key first described in the 15th century by German Benedictine abbot Johannes Trithemius, who was a personal instructor for two of the most notorious magicians, Agrippa and Paracelsus. This is interesting. There's a school of thought that he left the scrolls and that they got translated into English, and then they were supposed to be deposited for these people to find at a certain point, and that the mystery schools let them out directly. Inside the scroll, and this person found it now in an antique store, inside the scroll is information about someone in Germany who can unlock the key for them, who is part of one of the mystery schools. So we can consider it the greatest coincidence that this person just happened to walk in there and get it, or we can say, well, maybe it was placed there for them. And whatever the case is, it ends up in the hands of Mathers. Now, Mathers is interesting because he is somebody who is a polyglot, and he is, a master translation person. And he's just basically given to philosophical endeavors and magical practices. So he is finding through his connection with these libraries all of these old versions about the keys of Enoch and things of this nature. And he is interpreting them and bringing these books, which have been hidden in medieval libraries for centuries, out to the public. And then boom, this scroll and the whole Trithemius ceremonial magic lands in his lap, along with this direct connection to a woman in Germany. Now, this is interesting. There's a couple of different academic papers. There's a lot of books about this character, but I found one academic paper written by Christopher McIntosh at the University of Exeter. He just has a couple of insights about this person. And so he starts off with this and says, of all the mysteries connected with the origins of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, none is more teasing than the riddle of the so-called Fräulein Sprengel letters. For readers less familiar with the Golden Dawn's inception, it might be helpful to recapitulate the basic facts as we know them. The story goes that in 1887, Dr. William Westcott, London coroner. He's one of the people who founded the Golden Dawn. And Freemason with strong esoteric leanings came into the possession of a manuscript written in a cipher based on Benedictine abbot Johannes Trithemius. When deciphered, the manuscript was found to contain skeleton descriptions of rituals written in English, apparently stemming from an order with a grade structure similar to the Rosicrucians. And he goes a little bit deeper here about Kabbalah and all the rest. What's interesting is Anna Sprengel is the name of the initiate. And she basically says, if you come into possession of the scrolls, it means you're ready, get in contact, and, we'll get things going. Now, the story goes for the Golden Dawn that Mathers is the one who gets in touch, and that he becomes connected directly to this German Rosicrucian mystery school. Now, I have to say that it seems like Germany and France and England are major centers for the mystery schools in this period, and America, of course. But Germany shows up over and over again regarding the Rosicrucians, which makes me wonder if, that original explosion which happened there in Germany with the Rosicrucians, if that didn't just continue on and they built the schools out. In any case, when we get to a point with the Golden Dawn where Mathers has taken this on, he actually is very interesting because he has an initiatory background with the Masons. And so he's taking on this whole other level. Now he's creating an order where he will initiate people into the order. Now, what's interesting is the first person that he initiates into the order is his wife. And this is interesting too, because here we have Blavatsky founding Theosophy. Emma Britton is there. So you have two women and one man with Alcott. And, Besant will take over for Blavatsky. So there's a lot of women coming to the fore in these groups. And suddenly we have Mathers, getting initiated by a woman in this German mystery school, and then him making a woman the first initiate of the Golden Dawn system. That's pretty interesting when we get to this level, because we're seeing that women are playing a dramatically bigger role, and this may be part of what is taking place and what's going to need to take place in order to set the tone for the future. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're here tonight going deep on the mystery schools, the mystery of the Golden Dawn, and MacGregor Mathers and Aleister Crowley and the whole gang. We're going to be taking your questions in part 2 of tonight's program. I'm going to see how much I can get through this tonight. I sense we're going to have a part 2 with this as well. Okay. How are you doing out there?
Good. S. Scher said that mystery group in Germany was the Kempten Group, which initiated Steiner, among other things. And the Philip K. Dick Film Festival says Steiner ran an OTO chapter before Crowley took it over.
Well, that's a tricky one. Yeah. He was asked about that. And what he said literally was that he didn't have anything to do with the OTO. And that because of the way that all the groups were overlapping at the time, they asked him for some technical purpose if he would could identify himself that way for like a limited thing while they were getting a new person in. So Steiner never considered himself associated with OTO, although Crowley did. And, Steiner, look, he turned his nose up at Theosophy. Can you imagine? He's not going to work with black magicians. But it is interesting because Steiner talks in very realistic terms about the groups that are, working with Ahriman and bringing in this whole black magic piece and how they're on the same level. This is very important on our side, I think, to consider this. But, spiritual science and anthroposophy, the people who rise in the mystery school traditions under Rosicrucian mysteries, the people in the other schools are on the same level of knowledge. It's just that their application is different. One group is using it for a more unselfish purpose. They're dedicated to the cause. They're dedicated to the whole purpose behind the Rosicrucians, the Rosy Cross, and the religious impact that it has, the spiritual impact on the culture. And the other group, as I said, it's not necessarily that left-hand groups are evil, but there are levels inside the left-hand groups that operate completely in an evil fashion. So, but groups themselves who are on the left don't necessarily have to be. They can become dedicated in a selfish fashion. So, however you'd want to rank that. But Steiner himself said that there were gradations on the left-hand path, and at a certain point, there's deep black. That's tricky. That's very, very tricky. But what's interesting is somebody who comes in to this whole Golden Dawn piece, who thinks that he is going to bring Rosicrucian angels and everything else, is Aleister Crowley. I kid you not. This is where this episode is going to take an interesting turn, because we're going to see Crowley take a few interesting turns, and Mathers too. I've got the Crowley piece here, but I wanted to show some of these women. I'm going to go through these women in some detail, but almost all of them are involved in the theater. This is interesting too, because we remember with the Emma Britton information that so much that Emma Britton went through, she was an actress. She was somebody who was basically like a Broadway star. And they brought her all over Europe doing these different things, but she was being used in the background as a somnambulist medium. There's a piece there. There's a network that goes through acting. There's a network that goes through literary worlds. There's a network that goes through the political piece. And this is where all the mysteries take us. So there's the first initiate, Moina Mathers. And she's very interesting. I'll tell you what's fascinating about her. She's clairvoyant, and she has this very interesting Gurdjieff connection, which is her brother is Henry Bergson, and Bergson will become a very notable Gurdjieff student. So there's a lot of crossover here. I'm also going to mention that Mathers was approached by Madame Blavatsky, and she said, I know what you're doing in the Western tradition that's informing you. We can merge forces and you can go further. But Theosophy was already on its way, and you would think that Mathers would have done it, but he didn't. So that's another thing that might have saved what he was doing. Moina is fascinating in her own right, in that she moves the Golden Dawn forward, and with her own abilities becomes basically a strong leader inside the group. Someone else I think who's notable here is Florence Farr, and I'm going to describe that there's an Isis Urania temple inside of Golden Dawn. And so she's a very famous actress of the period. And when she takes it on, it leads to other people in acting becoming very involved in Golden Dawn ceremonial magic. And she's actually one of the leading actresses of the day. But, there's a whole piece there where W.B. Yeats becomes involved in a leader of Golden Dawn. So suddenly, from being just the strange thing that gets founded with the scroll, and Mathers, who spends all his time at the university library, now it's spreading out and it's going through different parts of the very, very interesting pieces of London. This is all, a lot of it's emanating out of London. In the middle of all this, this woman becomes interested in it, and her name is Anne Herneman, but she's a wealthy tea heiress. In fact, her grandfather created the tea bag, and she will fund Mathers and his wife to create a much larger version of the Golden Dawn, and in fact, they do. So those are the foundational aspects. So basically, what we've got up to this point is, Trithemius leaves behind these scrolls, and then they get translated into English and left in an antique store. And then the founders of the Golden Dawn come across them, along with information linking them to a mystery school in Germany. And then Anna Sprengel is this mystery figure who initiates Mathers into the mysteries in Germany. and he becomes basically their representative. Now, that's all Rosicrucian based training, the whole thing that we have for the Golden Dawn. And the thing that they are trying to communicate with on their side, and that they think they are dealing with directly, as the Great White Brotherhood, which is the same group, which is basically the top mystery school. And I think when you look at this, we're seeing that there are different individuals being keys for things, given keys for things. So in Theosophy, as Steiner put it, true initiators stood at the cradle of Theosophy. So, Blavatsky is working with initiates from these groups trying to create something. And we get so many things I point out about Theosophy, like meditation. The first cremation was done on American soil. Psychic activity, the idea of reincarnation, all these things, yoga becomes popularized by the Theosophical Society. But look at Golden Dawn. Think of like the Rider-Waite deck and ceremonial magic and all these different things that we run into as a result of their influence. And then we start to get a piece of like, oh, we can see that the schools did impact the culture dramatically. But along the way, things got really messed up because many of the groups, and I think in this case, Mathers, who's somebody we're going to get into a little bit more. I have some interesting.
Can I chime in for a second?
Oh, yeah.
So Josh says that Mathers, as in Marshall Mathers' great-great-great-grandpa, according to Eminem's mom's book. For reals. And Skinny Deform says, have you guys seen Eminem's most recent album cover? Tons of Freemason symbolism. But that, of course, is the music industry.
That's pretty funny. Well, this is the interesting thing, which is Eminem is Marshall Mathers. But, that thing about the book and his mother, if you want to send it to me, send it to admin@darkjournalist.com. That would be helpful because Mathers has a very interesting ancestral connection. MacGregor Mathers, he's a relative of Alice Little. As I pointed out, that's going to become important as we roll this out. But if he's directly related to Eminem, yeah, I'm going to be interested in that. This, just to give us some idea about Mathers, we can see him, in that Egyptian garb there. We can see him in his military uniform and then as an older man teaching. What's interesting about Mathers is he has kind of interpersonal problems. He's not the best leader type, but he's incredibly talented and earnest. And this is the interesting thing. What happens is there's a great letter that I was looking at earlier, which is, and once in a while Crowley does this, but I was reading Crowley talking about Mathers, and he was like, oh, well, Mathers lost his moral compass, and that's how he lost the leadership of the Golden Dawn. And it's always great whenever it comes up with Crowley, like, if he says someone's losing their moral compass, think about that. Okay, let's just get some idea of how the Golden Dawn saw itself and how Mathers was recreating the mystery tradition in the 19th century. A Masonic's design stood at the core of the organizing principle of the order. The order, Golden Dawn, applied explicitly to the outer order, to which anyone could apply. It taught the basis of esoteric philosophy using the Kabbalistic tree of life. Each level being a grade, membership started outside the tree. The first level of sphere followed. Now, this is interesting because there's a group inside Golden Dawn called the Sphere that will try to take it over in a decade. Each initiation ceremony opened a sphere for the student, which meant a set of skills to be acquired and theoretical knowledge. The advance was then a symbolic movement up the tree of life. This is interesting, too. While you're getting information about the nature of reality and all this deeper esoteric information, they're also pointing you onto life skill activity. So, they're going to make one person focus very heavily on language. They're going to make another person study very heavily on music. This is how the school is identifying types that they're running across and how they can bring their abilities to the fore. And so a lot of arts and sciences get included in the talents, the inner talents, and the latent things that they want to bring out and make them manifest. The second or inner order is called the Order of the Rose of Ruby and Cross of Gold, using the first order's knowledge, but approached its practical applications lightly. A practice was developed leaning on the knowledge gained in the outer order to assist the initiate in the spiritual path to explore and fulfill their will. The third order, referring to the secret chiefs, these were entities probably human, but not incarnated. Contacting them was part of the work of the second order. It's interesting because the layout of the Golden Dawn and their order was that's one of their original sketches, and it's there. There'll be more on that soon, but I want to basically point out that they have some idea immediately of how this thing is going to function. So they're kind of being given a preset rollout of the whole thing. Mathers will show up in the Egyptian magic piece, and he's going to garb himself in Egyptian magic. What's interesting is he and his wife are going to do an entire Egyptian Isis ritual on stage at a theater in Paris. That actually happened. Mathers basically has a hard time bringing the organization together. His leadership skills don't cut it. So even though he has all the connections and all the rest of it, there's something missing there. And what happens is a few people try to fill in the role, and Yeats is one of them. But before we get to him and his impact on it, I want to do this little piece around Crowley because it's interesting. Crowley is kind of the most famous student of the Golden Dawn, but he's not there very long. But he makes complete havoc when he's there. And here's the other thing. When he encounters Golden Dawn, he's only 22 years old. So, you know, he's already sort of vying for the leadership. And he's another one that we get a very different spin on originally. And he does, you know, he degenerates in later life. But there's obviously something driving him earlier on, which puts him on this path. And Mathers thinks this guy's an incredible magician. He's going to be a perfect student for the school and all the rest. And other people aren't going for it because Crowley has such a bombastic personality. Now, Crowley is somebody who at university, he was identified as a genius. He was a chess master. And, you know, this was somebody who was going to move into very high intellectual circles. His dad was wealthy, but died when he was 11. And his mother, it's interesting, they were both, the mother and the father, part of an extreme religious sect of Christianity. And the mother, whenever he, you know, was a problem child, referred to him, called him a beast. You're the beast, you know, you're the devil's beast, cast the devil out of you, and all this. So this is what Crowley got going up. So when we see Crowley become, you know, out of his head later, we get kind of a pinch of it with his early upbringing and the religious, you know, I'm going to purify you, you evil thing, that kind of thing when he's a kid. And that includes things like, you know, withholding meals from him and stuff like that when he's bad. So we instantly get kind of a twist there early in life where he's involved and he's kind of parroting his father as a Christian, but feels persecuted by his mother. And then the father dies and Crowley's stuck with the mother. So he's somebody who, you know, basically becomes a deviant in the middle of all this, but he is still, he decides, you know, I'm going to, instead of taking all of these other qualities that I have, I'm going to go straight for the religious piece. And I'm going to find that there's a new religion that I can be a part of. Yeah. What do you got?
Traveling Riverside Blues Johnson wants to know, did he talk to the dead? Did he have psychic abilities? Was he, or did that awaken after initiations and drugs?
Well, no, he definitely, you know, obviously Crowley was some kind of reincarnated sorcerer because he took to all this immediately. He had psychic experience. He talked with entities, you know, he had all kinds of things along this line, but he had a fascination for ceremonial magic, which is interesting in itself. I would also say that there's a lot of pieces about him which aren't brought up very often, but might explain his character a little bit. For example, he was an avid mountain climber. And this is interesting. So he had this whole kind of different other life going on. That's a shot of him as a mountain climber. I found that very fascinating. And he climbs one of the 3 tallest points in the world as a mountain climber. And there are people like Colin Wilson who investigate, his background, and like he could have easily gone off to become like a famous mountain climber, but it doesn't happen. Instead, his obsession around the religious piece becomes huge. Crowley becomes, one of the top people at Golden Dawn because he has such a natural predilection for magic. And what's interesting is that Mather sees him as somebody, who he can bring up to really dominate, but everyone else hates him, to put it mildly. And he is also somebody who believes at this stage that he's bringing the true gospel, that he's enlightened and that he wants to connect with God and love and all this stuff. So later we get a whole different, I am the devil, I'm the beast thing, which is interesting because it's the ultimate kind of revulsion against religion that he was brought up with that he felt, had terrified him. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show deep tonight on the Golden Dawn. So many of you here with us tonight, and it's great to have you. There's a lot of familiar faces tonight. We're taking your questions in the second half of tonight's program. We might do 2 parts on Golden Dawn. But Olivia, how are you doing out there?
Action Faction wants to know, wasn't Crowley a double agent at some point, CIA and MI6?
Yeah, he will do spying during World War II, and during World War I. This is another interesting thing, but there's a lot of aspects around the governments using psychically talented individuals, as we've discussed in previous programs. But for example, you've got the Tsars hiring Gurdjieff. And these things become important, I think, just to get a grasp of the people themselves. Excuse me. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show, X Series 146 tonight. It's the Golden Dawn. We're going to take it one step further, going a little deeper with what happens with the dissolution of the Golden Dawn and what was it all about? Where was it heading? The idea, it might have been out of place, out of time, but they were bringing the ceremonial magic piece back, and this was going to be a whole way for them to initiate these Rosicrucian rituals in public. Now, fundamentally, when we think about ceremonial magic, we think about some of the worst because we've had so many bad examples of it. And so many of the groups that broke off from these different sects would practice black arts using ceremonial magic. When we see now a large-scale occult ritual like the Super Bowl, I kid you not, and so many people are aware, like, oh my God, they're using this occult symbol, that occult symbol. That is the connection that we have with it. However, in fact, ceremonial magic in all its power can be used in exactly the opposite fashion. So again, it is indeed, it's the way that you use the thing. What the schools were trying to do at this point, and what I believe they abandoned, was, and because you saw some of this with anthroposophy putting on plays and things, and the Gurdjieff movements groups doing performances in theaters, they were trying to reach people beyond just intellectual means. So it's one thing if somebody sits down and learns a whole system intellectually. It does actually organize their mind and their thinking dramatically well. However, when you're dealing with schools, they're always working on different lines. So they'll work on mental lines, psychological lines, emotional lines, spiritual lines. And when you get into those different lines, just reading something wrote out of a book or learning a new system, even if it's interesting, comes in at an intellectual level. So it has to be kind of a sort of a well-rounded experience. So you might say that, for example, if you're at a concert or something of this nature and you get a feeling of excitement around a song, or the whole environment, that's a certain type of connecting, with a feeling. And so thinking kind of goes out the window, right? Thinking brings us into a different state. It's a different level of interaction. So we have all these different sides, and the goal for the schools is to have all the sides grow at a similar balanced pace, so that somebody's not too much of a thinker and completely disconnected from their emotions, or somebody's not just all into their emotions and they let their emotions run their lives, and so on. So it gets very deep into the whole psychology of the human being. And we get the whole school of psychology that comes out of this era. In fact, what happens is the Golden Dawn theosophy and anthroposophy, this big explosion that comes out of the 19th century into the 20th century and thrives early in the 20th century. But it's really psychology that takes the role. And psychology, in many aspects, will try to despiritualize the entire experience of living. And so everyone will think, instead of communing with nature or something like that, I'm going to go get therapy. That's not to diss psychology by any stretch of the imagination. There's incredible benefits that arise out of it. What I'm saying is there's a split there that wasn't present before. And what happened before was you would have people who were well grounded in all these different things. So you get people, Renaissance men like Goethe, and he's good at plants and flowers. He can write books about botany and all the rest, but he's also writing Faust and he's also, doing concertos and things like that. So he has a well-rounded expression of his tools for psychic expression. So it's kind of interesting when we get into this and how the schools work. And I'll get back into that because I think it forms the frame around what's trying to be done. But what happens is the Golden Dawn piece about coming forward and saying, we're going to be this initiatory body and we're going to attract these people who have major influence in culture. And, they'll get into the magic aspect and they'll improve their own spirituality. And so therefore they'll have a bigger impact. And so that's why you get them attracting all these musicians and artists and all the rest. I believe that whole situation's in reverse now, and that the ceremonial magic that's in charge, what is taken over, they've actually taken over and hijacked the Golden Dawn ceremonial magic from the late 19th century. And that's the thing that we learned so much about. So like, the Church of Satan or LaVey and all those things that were so prevalent in the 60s and 70s that dominated the culture on the entertainment side. You had people like Sammy Davis Jr. joining the Church of Satan, and there's a huge wave around it. This to me is all the hijacking very early on of what was happening, what was emerging. So the people who were doing the Golden Dawn work, they were to be the buffer against ceremonial magic being used in a haphazard fashion. Let's get into some more of them, actually. And also later influence of Crowley on culture. We know that Jimmy Page, of course, was very, very into doing those rituals. There are great stories about Bowie getting into this and Jimmy Page trying to be, outdo him and make him depressed and things of this nature. And so there's a few stories about Bowie telling him to get lost, basically, all due to the fact that, they're both kind of in that magic sphere, but he was perceiving Jimmy Page as very negative, doing very negative things with it. Bowie, it's interesting because he'll have a period where he's obsessed with it, but Bowie will have fascinations for different things. So, John Lennon will have a period where he talks about Crowley a lot. So it gets in there, it gets in the 60s culture and it informs it. Now, the reason it does is not because Crowley is just, an evil genius. It's because what he brings forward, remember, he has the training now from all these different groups, and he's come through the Golden Dawn initiations. He's got all that information. And who had that information originally? Trithemius had that information and had to get it out through these stenographic means. And so that means it was deep, deep inside the mystery schools. So it can happen that somebody can get the information from the mystery schools, be a great magician, and then unravel. But they can have a big impact on the culture, and people can sense that there's something truthful in what they're writing, even though, we'll look back and say, well, this person, they were on a totally selfish track. It's interesting, actually. There's a famous case in 1934 where Crowley will sue a journalist for calling him a black magician. He did not consider himself a black magician. Think about that. So this becomes interesting. There's a couple of just funny pop culture things here. That's a shot of the Beatles and Sgt. Pepper. This is interesting because, of course, Crowley appears on the cover of Sgt. Pepper. That's a shot of it before they're actually in the picture, so you can almost see it a little bit better. He's right up there. It's hard to miss, but very interesting that he's making headway. He has kind of a renaissance in the 60s. And Crowley himself will die in 1947. I mentioned Bowie earlier. There's some photo shoots that Bowie does where he imitates some of the Crowley Egyptian gestures. And there's a period there where Bowie is considering, I'm going to come out and be this character who's an ancient Egyptian. And he was going to call it the Sphinx, but he drops the entire thing and he does Space Age Ziggy instead. So that's the other thing about Bowie. Although he got into, studying the Tree of Life and Crowley and all this piece, he then gets into Blavatsky after that. That's another one of those Tree of Life shots. That's the Kether to Malkuth, which comes directly out of that, Kabbalah tradition, and comes from, originally a very incredibly beneficial source, and then gets, twisted into a left-hand thing. But interestingly enough, I want to mention that about Bowie because he becomes a born-again Christian at a certain point. Then he's a Tibetan Buddhist, so this is a guy he wants a lot of different types of experiences. What do you got?
Robert Devine, why do you think music artists resonated so much with Crowley?
Well, the whole thing about the law, and the law was about freedom, right? So it's interpreted as, you have the freedom to do whatever you want without the persecutions of these religions, which you can see it like, it's a big discussion when you get into it because, there are a lot of things done in the name of Christianity that have nothing to do with Christianity, as we know, so they have liberation wars where they just want to kill a bunch of people and they'll say it's under the name of Christianity. So, Cortez, this is always a great example for that. I'm going to kill all the Aztecs for Christ. That's, I mean, who's the savage there? It's Cortez. But for me, when I look at it, what I see is that there's a point in a period that people get to where they're breaking out of the religious, doctrine. Now, there's a real problem with this. There's a few different ways to look at it, but fundamentally, I'll sum it up this way. When you get an entire culture that in the 1960s is suddenly dealing with freedom around drugs, sex, and religion and all the rest of it, it is interesting because all those influences, remember, that were setting the tone right around the turn of the century, they're all vying for what they see is coming, which is there's going to be an opportunity for people to really choose for themselves. So, the mystery schools really want to move the culture in a direction where people make the right choices. But the left-hand schools delight in the pageant of, people doing themselves in through excess. And we see that, is so prevalent in the entertainment industry as it is now. If anything, the entertainment industry seems to have degenerated dramatically. So I think that maybe is part of the answer to it. I remember reading one of Ledbetter's books where he talks about what takes place during a festival. And then I started to think about it in relation to concerts. And he talked about how basically people's astral bodies are swinging when they're at these festivals, and he's observing music festivals, back in 1910, 1915. There's, it's not even, there's not even a rock scene yet. So, what happens when it's like a major festival. So you can imagine there's a lot of manipulation that goes on with entities and things of this nature when you get into those states. So if you can see them, if you're somebody who's an initiate, if you walked into like, a concert, you can see that type of activity. Now, at the same time, there's a tremendous, and I think tremendous opportunity with the bringing together of, large groups of people for music or theater, whatever it happens to be. It can actually have them transcend their entire experience. So, again, it's all of those things are what the intention is behind them. But there's no question that when you look at the 60s, Crowley's he's a big influence. There's no doubt about it. And I think that Casey becomes a big influence because The Sleeping Prophet comes out, and Casey's been dead for 20 years, just like Crowley has been dead. But suddenly, when you're hot, you're hot. Mm-hmm. That's where we get the whole Atlantis craze, really. Okay, one thing I wanted to show, which was a creation of Trithemius, is this little device, which looks like a very early version of a Ouija board to me. But obviously, there's not a whole lot that's known about its use. He's using the sacred Hebrew alphabet and some other pieces. But something about that grabs me. And again, knowing that he's the master of steganography, I spent some time checking that out. But it seems to me that when we get to the Ouija board and things about bringing the spirits in, he must have realized that there was a method to doing that. And later, I think that was imitated with the Ouija board and things of that nature. That was Trithemius there. Now, so we get to a period here where Yeats takes over. And this is interesting, too. There's a couple of things about Yeats. Of course, one of the greatest poets and just a fascinating individual. And there he is looking at his lifelong muse who rejected his hand in marriage on a few occasions. It's very interesting because Yeats, in taking over, becomes an initiate himself of this order. And then what he realizes is that Crowley has to go. That's the first, the first step. And so they go to expel Crowley, and then Mathers feels like he's losing the entire organization. He's in France, and he has that woman who is the tea heiress, and she's supporting him. But she starts to realize, well, he's not spending enough time building up Golden Dawn. It's not what it should be. You're supposed to create all these theater events. You're supposed to grow the membership and all the rest of it. There's a lot of interest around the Golden Dawn, but the infighting is dramatic. And so what takes place is he sends Crowley as his emissary, basically, to take back over the Golden Dawn from Yeats and all the other people who've taken over. And it's quite interesting because he goes back there and he fails, basically. They shut him out. And so Crowley's out, and he also bails on Mathers. Mathers is in France, and he circulates these letters saying, either you swear unity to me or you're cut off, and, I'll start the Golden Dawn on my own or whatever. And so the group splinters into 5 different pieces. And so we'll never know exactly what would have happened had it stayed united. But what we do know is that Mathers continues to degenerate. And by 1918, he's dead. And basically, he hasn't contributed much in the past 20 years. He hasn't done any great activities. So when he loses the Golden Dawn, he basically unravels. And he loses, of course, the funding of the tea heiress. And so the two of them, Moyna and McGregor Mathers, they lose the thread, and the incredible Golden Dawn that they were supposed to build for the Rosicrucian initiates to influence the culture goes down as well. Now, some of the things that Mathers would write, and they, Crowley and Mathers wrote negative things about each other. But in Crowley, what Crowley did say was, I knew that he was in touch with the mystery schools, which is why I hung in there so long. So, whatever it was that Mathers had, people understand, they understood that he was connected with the schools. But it is interesting because what goes on is Mathers loses Crowley's support. He loses the Golden Dawn. Yeats, basically takes over, and then that group can't stay together and they splinter. But there's a group that comes up inside of it as part of the Isis Urania temple, and that is the Sphere group. And the Sphere group takes over. And it's interesting to me because they have all of these kind of entertainment connections in the period, as I was speaking about, through theater and other things. And their mastery around the ceremonial magic is, many of them have been initiated through the grades in the Golden Dawn. It seems to me that foundationally, what we get when we get that huge wave of ceremonial magic that invades, and becomes such a centerpiece for the entertainment industry, that the roots of it are right there in that Sphere takeover of the Golden Dawn in that period of around 1900. And, let's face it. I mean, I can't think of, there's all sorts of Catholic Church rituals, and there's all sorts of different types of rituals. But if you, in terms of thinking of positive rituals, you literally will think about, there are Wiccan groups and things of this nature who will do it, or white witches, and will do these ceremonies. But in general parlance, just how people deal with the idea, it seems to me that generally it has a very negative association, unfortunately, because, of course, all of the mystery school traditions include ceremonial magic and, all the things that are associated with it. But in culture, we have a negative connotation to it, and it's been used in a lot of movies. Let's face it. One of the weird things about all this is that it seems when we start to look at what the Golden Dawn got accomplished, parts of it are quite major, and the tarot deck itself is quite important. This is interesting. So Waite becomes an initiated member of the Golden Dawn, and he comes together with a female artist, and she's really quite remarkable. She's British, and her name is Pamela Coleman Smith, but she will, do all the illustrations for Bram Stoker, who's also part of the Golden Dawn. Yeats is part. She'll do illustrations for him. And she will take that tradition of tarot and bring it out in this Golden Dawn fashion. So that, for example, with cards like the High Priestess, we have it loaded now with different types of steganography in the real tarot tradition. So she resurrects something from the Montaigne Tarocchi, that original Italian group of tarot cards that were floating around. Interestingly enough, Crowley himself finds an enlightened idealist who is into, incredible art. And he, instead of taking the reins and I want you to make a black magic deck or whatever, he wants to compete with Waite, but he wants to show I can be just as spiritual as you are. And that deck is absolutely unbelievable, as we know. But a quick thing about the steganography in the High Priestess pillars. I want to do this. Boaz and Jachin. So according to the Bible, Boaz and Jachin were two copper, brass, or bronze pillars which stood at the porch of Solomon's temple, the first temple in Jerusalem. They're used as symbols in Freemasonry, sometimes in religious architecture. They were probably not support structures, but freestanding based on similar pillars found in nearby temples. So to bring in that Solomon's Temple piece with the high priestess in the decks, and then you're crisscrossing Masonic imagery in there with these Golden Dawn Rosicrucian bits, it's suggestive that there's a collaboration going on in the background about trying to get these symbols out. And so many people are going to come into contact with those cards. 100 million people. They're going to sell 100 million decks over the next century from when they get put out. Think about the impact that that has, and think about the mystery of those cards. So there's a wonderful book which goes into, see how I'm going to do this. It's called Meditations on the Tarot, and it's by P.D. Ouspensky, who is, as we know, the top student of Gurdjieff. And you might think, well, this is interesting because, you know, Gurdjieff tried to get rid of so much of the, you know, theosophical imagery. So things like tarot, you would think, well, interestingly enough, he did this book before he was sort of under Gurdjieff's whip, as it were. And it's quite interesting because, you know, they're going to give a little description. So basically, Ouspensky goes into almost a meditative trance with each one of the cards and spends all this time with it. This is what he came up with for the High Priestess. And the book is called Symbolism of the Tarot. That's the one. But I think it's significant in this sense. When I lifted the first veil and entered the outer court of the Temple of Initiation, I saw in half darkness the figure of a woman sitting on a high throne between two pillars in a temple, one white and one black. Mystery emanated from her, and I was about her, Sacred symbols shone on her green dress. On her head was a golden tiara surmounted by a two-horned moon. On her knees, she held two crossed keys and an open book. Between the two pillars behind the woman hung another veil, all embroidered with green leaves, the fruits of pomegranate. And a voice said, to enter the temple, one must lift the second veil and pass between the two pillars. And to pass thus, one must obtain possession of the keys, read the book, and understand the symbols. Are you able to do this? I'd like to be able to do it, I said. Then the woman turned her face to me and looked into my eyes without speaking, and through me passed a thrill, mysterious, penetrating like a golden wave, tones that vibrated in my brain. A flame was in my heart, and I understood that she spoke to me, saying without words, this is the hall of wisdom. No one can reveal it. No one can hide it. Like a flower, it must grow in your soul. Learn to discern the true from the false. Listen only to the voice that is soundless. Look only on that which is invisible. And remember that in thee thyself is the temple and the gate to it and the mystery and the initiation. That's the vision that Ouspensky has for that Golden Dawn card. So when we think of it that way, you know, the deck itself is an open initiation to this. And I think his nature, taking a look at it, is somebody who, you know, Ouspensky is a pretty sober person and didn't let his imagination run away with him very much. He obviously got the deep implications when looking at that. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. We're here tonight looking at the mystery of the Golden Dawn, and that's Samuel Little McGregor Mathers, who founded the Golden Dawn with help from Frau Anna Sprengel out there in Rosicrucian land. We're going to be taking your questions. Oh, well, we should start taking your questions pretty soon. You know what I'll do? I have a whole piece here about Alice and the Golden Dawn.
Do it.
And no, what I'm going to do is we're going to start taking your questions, and I'm going to work this in as we go here, because this is very, I have to say that the combination of Little being related to Alice is a mind blower, and that's going to take us into some very interesting places. Miss Olivia, with that,
Okay.
you're up.
All right. So obviously, we're going to talk about relationships. HWMO Liberty, was Crowley really Barbara Bush's daddy?
Well, look, there's a lot of stories that float around the internet, and there was one story that John Trump was Julian Assange's dad, and they altered the Photoshop to make it look like that. I have a good Photoshop fake I want to show tonight, too. But I will say this, of all those stories that have floated around, there is actually a very good foundation for thinking Barbara Bush is Crowley's daughter, believe it or not. And it literally involves her mother being coerced by a group of people to go visit Crowley when he's in Sicily. And if you've ever seen that comparison photo of Barbara Bush with Crowley, now they can do things with Photoshop to make it look like that. But if you get a picture of her on her own and a picture of Crowley on his own, they have an incredible similarity. And there is, in fact, there was an obsession by that group around Barbara's mother for Crowley, and that's why they went to visit him. So therefore, the mother could have been there and been involved in some Crowley sex ritual and become pregnant and had his daughter. So of all the crazy things that float around on the internet, that one actually has some possibilities.
Okay.
Go
Next,
for it. Yes.
Brian Storm, I think Crowley played up the image and had fun with it. Even Gurdjieff said he was mostly an image, but that in his prime, he could control the bodies of others just by walking by them in the street.
Yeah. Well, there's abuse of ceremonial magic, but the magicians themselves are, really powerful. And, I remember stories about Gurdjieff being rudely treated by this woman and then breathing a certain way and her collapsing. So there are all sorts of things that human beings are prone to. And, he also, don't make me have Gurdjieff sound like a villain, because he also used those techniques to heal people and things like that. But there are, in general, rules against that kind of negative activity, after developing sacred abilities. It is interesting, though, because there's a very famous story about Crowley and this woman who was had taken him to court and things of this nature, and how she confronted him in public, thinking the cameras were going to pick up on what a great, grandstander she was against this evil guy. And he was like tapping his cane and she started barking like a dog. So, there's a weird, when you get into magic, really, it's just like when you get into hypnotists, it's, there's all sorts of strange things that are going on there. I would think in general, people who get to a level like that with magic don't use it for parlor tricks, but there are exceptions to the rule. What do you got?
Mousted says Barbara's mother was a 25-year-old maid in a home where Crowley was staying, and they had an affair in the year before Barbara was born. That is true for sure.
Well, I'd heard it differently, that she had gone there to where he was, and that she had traveled there for 6 weeks. It's the maid part. There's always a maid in there, right? It's like Hitler's maid was a rough job.
Exactly.
Maybe. I'm not, if you have it, actually send it to me at admin@darkjournalist.com. I'll take a look at it.
Okay. Are you? You haven't spoken about Boleskine House yet, have you?
Well, that's interesting. That was the page thing, but yeah, that's Loch Ness and Boleskine House. That's part of where our friend Crowley had gone away to do this ritual, and Boleskine House is a really interesting story on its own. It already had a weird history, but what happens is, Crowley, when he's 21, this is another weird thing. He inherits all that father's money in a trust fund. So he can do anything he wants. He gets out of school immediately. That's warning sign number 1. 2, he doesn't have to work. That's a problem too. So he spends all his time doing this magic stuff, and he decides to buy Boleskine House, which is this incredible castle on the Scotland shores of the loch. And that's the whole piece there. The Loch Ness Monster is seen there now. And it's interesting because one of the leading Loch Ness Monster investigators in the 70s observed that all the sightings around the Loch Ness Monster and that whole piece happened after Crowley did this amazing ritual there. So the ritual is called a Bremelin, and it's like the ultimate magician's ritual. And but you're still supposedly working on the light side, but you summon all these dark characters and you bind them with the light, right? Now, at the beginning of the spell, it actually is written there as an ancient spell, and it's written there, don't do this. So, but what happens is he gets this incredible castle to do it, and he's there alone for 6 months doing this ritual. And part of it involves blocking out all light where you are so you can see the entities you're interacting with. And he's doing all this stuff, starving himself and all the rest of it. And in the middle of it, he gets a telegram from Mathers in Paris who says, these people are trying to take away my organization. You won't believe what's going on. And you have to get over here immediately. And Crowley, remember that he knows that Mathers is his only connection to the schools. He goes there immediately. But what he realizes is that, oops, I forgot to close the door of the ritual. And so ever since that whole period, there's been all kinds of strange things that happened at the house. Jimmy Page bought it, in fact, and lived there, which is pretty kind of, that's really living the fantasy, right, to the hilt. But what I can say about it is, and what I think is interesting, is that people around there have seen all kinds of apparitions. And the people who are magicians who talk about that particular ritual say you're supposed to basically close up the ritual and, sort of shut the astral door on it. And he didn't. Now, it's interesting because years later, this will be used as the excuse for the whole Moonchild ritual, why we get the UFO apparitions happening in 1947, related directly again to the Crowley rituals that his student Parsons did in the desert with our friend L. Ron Hubbard. And Hubbard's another one that got this treatment by Crowley where he was like, if you go back and read the letters, they're hilarious because, Jack Parsons is like, I love hanging out with this Hubbard guy. He's great. We're doing all this stuff. And if you read, Crowley gives him like fatherly advice back. He's like, I don't know. He doesn't sound like, he sounds like a con man. I think he's a confidence man. And like, you really should watch out because it doesn't seem like he has any kind of moral bearing at all. So it's great. Actually, it's interesting in going over these pictures because, we always get that one hardcore picture of Crowley. Here's a shot of him. Look at this. It's Crowley the family man. Unbelievable. So you see the possibilities for these people. It's all in the choices, right? And unfortunately, tragically, his daughter dies of typhoid fever when he's over there in the East. And, there's a kind of Crowley has kind of a slip away quality. He's slipped into the role completely. He thought he was the reincarnation of a great Egyptian magician as well. And he may well have been, but whatever it was, that whole thing took him over. His own probably resentment of the incredible restraints of the religion that he was brought up under colored his entire life to just throw that over. Interesting shot of Crowley. I've never seen this before. At the end of his life, he owns a bookstore, and he has long since given up on becoming the great beast. But it's pretty interesting. And in fact, one of the final things that happens with him is he's in this court case where he calls out this person. It's about 10 years before that picture is taken, where he calls out this journalist for saying he's a black magician. And he goes to court to sue them for this. And he sees a woman in the audience and he walks up to her and says, I'm going to marry you and you're going to have my children. And I watched a whole interview with this woman who lived with him for as his wife for 12 years before he died. and said that when he died, it was there was incredible like thunderstorms, and things flew around and all kinds of weird poltergeist happened. But that in general, those last 12 years of his life with her like were spent pretty much in family. So, and she did in fact bear him a son. Isn't that strange? Imagine walking around. It's like walking around, as a notorious. Like, you ever hear the thing about the Hitler kids?
Go for it.
Oh, it's an interesting. It's one of those things where supposedly there were 2 Hitler children, and that they were educated first in Argentina and then in New Mexico. And we know that he had nephews and nieces who were around, or etc. But his actual kids, that's different, and supposedly was kept a secret this whole time. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Steiner to God. DJ, what about what Steiner said about rituals, particularly about the, quote, act of consecration of man, unquote, in the Christian community? He said real effects are seen in the spiritual world.
Oh, there's no question. I mean, in many ways, the Last Supper is ceremonial magic. There's no doubt about it. And it's a lesson. This is an interesting thing that I've learned by observing so many of these spiritual leaders, which is they teach in different ways. So we have some of them teaching in traditional ways that we understand. So, here's the doctrine, here's the Sermon on the Mount, as it were. But then you pass through to the art of living. And it's interesting because we look at periods of time, for example, Gurdjieff's life. At the end of his life, he's throwing these big dinners and he's putting all this effort into these dinners. And, there's no books coming out. He's not, supervising new groups and all this stuff. He's working really hard on dinners. And I started to wonder about it a little bit. And then I found this whole range of books of people who were talking about, I attended this Gurdjieff dinner and I learned this about myself, or I learned all these things that opened up before me. So the methods of teaching are sometimes very, very unusual or unique. And sometimes I think certain types of lessons we expect to get in grandiose fashion. And they might take a totally different guise, and that way we're in the right receptive state to receive them. So a conversation, I can say some of the most profound things in my life have happened during conversations. So, in terms of the impact of a thing, the art of living itself, I think, becomes very important. But to Steiner's point in the question, there's no question that ceremonial magic has its impact in the etheric, astral, and physical worlds. And again, it represents an intention. And this is something we get so much in the Native American traditions. Yes.
Alice on the Moon, how do you feel that Israel Regardie fits into the leader activities of the Golden Dawn?
Well, I like him. This is something interesting that he said after, he'd been with the Golden Dawn. He eventually wound up working with Dion Fortune. What's interesting is she, basically had moved the new level of the Golden Dawn. So she was going in a very positive direction with it. And I actually think that the positive thread of the Golden Dawn goes through the work of Dion Fortune. But Regardie had also admired Crowley so much that from 1928 to 1930, he became his secretary, basically for free. But he was a psychologist, and what he realized, he studied Crowley. He got away from Crowley and joined up with Fortune. But he studied all these different occult groups, and he said, I think what the problem is, this is my feedback for the mystery schools, which is that all these people have amazing talents, but they are almost infantile in their competitive nature. And so they all vie for leadership and think about taking the other one down. And it happens over and over again. And if when I was seeing things through his eyes and I was reading all the material about the Golden Dawn, that's exactly what happens. Yeats becomes this big figure that they want to get on board because he's a big public figure, and then he becomes the one who becomes their biggest enemy. And I know that he had his own ideas about how to, and I don't blame him for wanting to get rid of somebody like Crowley, but it's pretty interesting because you have these individuals, and as people, we have different types of strengths. So even Mathers, somebody who's in touch with a mystery school and has these incredible abilities of translation and brings all these works back. I mean, we owe a great debt in a sense to Mathers for doing this, because he got these texts revealed to English-speaking audiences for the first time. So all of that magical material that was there hanging out since the 14th century, suddenly everyone had access to it. And this is when we think about the type of impact it was supposed to make on society, well, in some ways it did. But I think the work continues because, unfortunately, that wave was so subverted that even Steiner, with anthroposophy, at the end is saying, I want to take anthroposophy and I want to reincorporate it as a different entity. And so there's a whole thing that takes place with this Hermetic brotherhood. And, they're going to create another mystery school with Steiner. And Steiner stops in the middle of it and says, we've reached a point where there can't be any more secrets as far as this information goes. So no, I'm not going to form something else out of anthroposophy. I'm going to keep on going with it. But he's also disappointed that anthroposophy got to a point where it did not prevent World War I. And what he says at that, I think, is very fascinating, which is he says, we were there to create this environment, and so if the mystery schools fail, if anthroposophy fails in its mission now, it's going to come back around in 100 years. So he writes that in 1920. So here we are in the window of that 2020 thing, and we need the real spiritual science. There's no question about it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, X Series 146. I want to remind you, if you're new here, especially, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That's a free newsletter, and it keeps us in touch with each other. We've experienced the de-amplification that they talk about in the Twitter files, where they target out a group or a channel for saying the wrong thing, and they don't get rid of them, but they de-amplify them. So they've been trying to do that so much, and we have such incredible we have such an incredible rapport with everyone in the ideas room and everything. And that comes through that newsletter. So even if you don't get a notification in a social media site or whatever it happens to be, however kind of suppression that they're trying to keep down, the best way to stay in touch with us is the newsletter. It's free, and it lets you know the incredible, amazing shows that we have coming up for you, as well as the remarkable interviews that you don't want to miss, and exciting documentaries and events later this year as well. So make sure that you stand up and be counted and be on there. And with that, Miss Olivia,
could
you're
you talk a minute about the Tong and the Shaolin, and as examples of the right and the left path?
Yeah, it's the same. It is the same type of problem. And it's interesting because traditionally, in the Shaolin temples, the people who formed the Tong, which becomes almost like a mafia, like a Chinese mystery school mafia, they use all the same skills and stuff to dominate, different provinces. And the training comes directly out of the Shaolin, which is the same thing as kind of that higher Rosicrucian type of amplification of thinking about higher thoughts and moving that out into the culture. What happens is people acquire the skills, and then the choice is ultimately left with them. But I think that when we look over the periods of the last, say, 150 years, you can really see intense activity between the mystery schools and the kind of battle inside of those mystery schools and secret societies. versus what happens on the ground. And so when you see things like the COVID op, or when you see intel groups trying to do a UFO threat or things of this nature, you're in you're in that space where they are utilizing abilities to do that. And not all of the abilities are just propaganda and things of that nature. There's definitely a magical core to that kind of glamorization. I think it was Alice Bailey wrote the book Glamour, a World Problem. And I never thought that Alice Bailey had any of the real power of the early theosophists. And this happens too, which is you get people carrying along in a tradition after the fact of the original thing happening, and then it kind of it loses some of the impact and it carries on in a different way. But I would say one of the things that I get from these groups generally is that they've planted the seeds, and you don't know when some kind of very inspired wind moves through that, and then you have a whole different direction happening. I know that this is a very special period of time in relation to this. So that's I think the period that we're in now. We're going to see a lot of the mystical tradition part. When people talk about, oh, I want disclosure, I want transparency and stuff, you don't get much from UFO disclosure on its own, so that's a little bit tricky. And I think that the UFO file and understanding its relationship to the entire problem of the culture today is dramatic. But you as an individual, I think the disclosure of your relationship to an earlier culture that was more advanced than the one we're living in is probably a more dramatic style of disclosure. Yes.
You cut me at a bad
moment. That's good. I'm going to read actually just a short section here. There's a lot of steganography in Alice in Wonderland, and I think Alice in Wonderland is one of the most important esoteric pieces of work ever done. I think that that's the reason why we hear that it gets utilized in things like MK Ultra training, or it gets utilized in these different ways. But fundamentally, I think upon its release, it was an invitation to an expanse of consciousness. And I think that the people behind it, Lewis Carroll is who we know is behind it, are directly plugged in to this Golden Dawn revelation that's happening. And again, the individuals involved have very interesting connections. One of the things that I learned, and I invite everyone to watch a show that I did on Alice in Wonderland, which is in the X series, top 15 X series playlist that's on this channel. And it goes in depth into Charles Dodgson's background. But the key concepts in there, the hurrier I go, the behinder I get, that's pure apotheum. And he's suggesting that there's a realm, a state that she gets into where time doesn't matter. And they are all the characters are informing her of these things. So there's a reason why that book has such an impact. And you can look at it in a number of different ways. But if you look at some of the early pictures of Dodgson when he's doing photography, he will often point to, and you have to keep in mind the whole piece about Emma Britton and how they used her as a somnambulist. If you look at this picture, it's actually quite fascinating. I'll describe a few things that are going on here. In fact, this girl is going into a trance, and she's manifesting a ghost who is in communication with her. And then behind the ghost is someone assisting on the astral plane who is also, kind of a ghostly figure. But there's a lot of esoteric information in his photographs. So look at that one.
Oh, it's great.
Quite remarkable. So what he is kind of using as a steganography is he's suggesting, you know, this information comes from a mediumistic source. And you see that over and over again in Alice in Wonderland. Now, there have been mathematicians who've studied Alice in Wonderland and also see various math formulas. But his familiarity with steganography also comes across. And so there's a number of unusual ciphers as well that show up in the book that spell her name and all the rest of it. But here's a couple of things I came across that I think kind of open up the Alice in Wonderland piece. By the way, that is Alice Little, and she's related directly to Samuel Little Mathers, who is the founder of the Golden Dawn. That's her a little more grown up. And that's the famous drawing of Alice, of course. Some of these interesting early versions of it, when it was called Alice in the Underground, and some of those original versions that has been on display. Very interestingly, someone put together a series of these and put it out, and people would show up and look at the original versions of it. There's been a lot of things that the actual original book of Alice in Wonderland. One of the things in the Hot Zone series I revealed is this great story about T.T. Brown that his daughter told me, which is that when he meets the man who's commanding the Caroline yacht, who's obviously very, deep and knowledgeable, and has him there off the coast of Cuba for a reason in 1930, just before great earthquake strikes. He shows him in a glass case the original version of Alice in Wonderland, and it's hermetically sealed. And T.T. Brown says, well, why do you have this like this? And he said, well, if they ever take down this yacht, Alice will survive. So there's a very interesting piece about that. What's fascinating is that guy will go to Calvin Coolidge's White House and show him, in fact, the original version of Alice. Here's a couple of things you probably didn't know about Alice. Alice Little had aspirations. Her mother had aspirations for her to marry into the upper class, and she earned the nickname Kingfisher. So, because she was always pushing her daughters to court the best of the best and meet new men to charm at parties. She should have been proud, because Alice very nearly married Queen Victoria's son, Prince Leopold. He was studying as an undergraduate at Oxford Christ Church when Alice's father worked. Unfortunately, members of the royal family were not allowed to marry anyone from the middle class. This almost happened, which would have made her, a princess. And the more we look at Alice Little, it becomes very interesting, the connection that she had going forward. That story, of course, is so interesting. But when we get some of those images of her as an adult, it's very Golden Dawn, temple garb setups. One of the things I found in relation to this, let's see if I have it here. There's actually a book. There's actually notations about a book where Lewis Carroll is writing in the margins about how he's going to use different types of steganography in different sections. It's only one page, and I'm going to show you that here. But this is interesting. I might actually tweet this out so everyone can take a look at it. But there's so many different things I could point out about it. But the page itself basically are just notes to himself about where he's going to insert certain types of steganography and what, how the impact is going to go on the page. That is quite interesting to me, because there's so much code in the way that he lays out Alice in Wonderland that, there's a huge crisscross there with that whole mystical tradition that comes up out of the Golden Dawn. And then when I see Alice kind of moving into those circles later. It seems to me that we need to understand that when he was at Oxford, he was in control of the Ashmolean library there at Oxford. That's basically the core of all the esoteric information, kind of like the Vatican Library for that at Oxford. And so we learn a great deal, I think, about Lewis Carroll and Alice in Wonderland. And I connect it directly to the Golden Dawn because of the fact that his muse, Alice Little, was in fact connected, related directly to our friend Mathers, who was chosen for this activity. And that's, again, one of those earlier chapters of Alice in Wonderland. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Trina Clark wanted to remind us that 2023 is the year of the rabbit.
Oh, hey, that's true.
So Kanka Kong says, was Lewis Carroll a member of any of the mystery schools that you know of, even though there is this link?
Well, he's part of the Psychical Research Society. Okay, so that is a huge interface with this. And he's also, what's interesting is he's noted as part of the Ghost Club. Now, the Ghost Club, primarily, it's like an occult group that just studies things publicly about in life after death and apparitions and things. However, Emma Britton had mentioned that the group that she had worked with was called the Orphic Circle, but she said later it would take on the name of the Ghost Club. So therefore, Carroll, as he would be, as a literary figure, major, who's interested in esoteric issues, would be recruited into something directly like that, the same way that she said when she was doing her medium trances, when Emma was doing her medium trances for the Orphic Circle, Charles Dickens was there, future Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli was there. And, those groups work with the highest levels of society and certainly great literary figures. So the fact that Carroll would be around the Ghost Club makes perfect sense. Yeats was in the Ghost Club. So, if we just open up our minds to the idea that, that's a lot. That's actually showing a lot of your heart on your sleeve when you're part of the Golden Dawn and part of the Ghost Club and things. Then you wonder, oh, what about behind the scenes? You're really involved in the machinery. So certainly I think there's a great crossover there. Yes.
Karen Carpenter, are there other classics known to have embedded steganography?
Well, there's so many. I mean, there's fairy tales and, everything from Little Red Riding Hood to Russian fairy tales. So no, it's throughout culture. Alice in Wonderland in particular, I think, is important because it represents dimensional activity and it reveals a great deal.
Gigi says Wizard of Oz.
Oh, excellent point. That's a great one, Gigi. And think about, how deep does that go? Again, you have Alice as the heroine and Dorothy as the heroine. And, the Red Queen is certainly something to be fought against. And certainly the evil witch is something to be fought against. So you're looking indeed there at an established evil coming into contact with what? It's innocence mixed with some special ability. And, you could call it a kind of psychic ability. But in each case, the heroine overcomes the obstacle. Yes.
Esoteric 369 Wall. Daniel, any thoughts on Leo Zagami's claim that Blavatsky was a Satanist?
No, I mean, I understand all that because there's a thread of theosophy which tries to open up the whole idea of Lucifer gnosis. So, and this is a whole conversation in itself, but, Steiner had a magazine called Lucifer Gnosis. So they view that whole Lucifer thing differently than the traditional devil Lucifer idea. Steiner calls the devil Ahriman, right? This is where he works with it, but he identifies Ahriman as separate from Lucifer, and that the Luciferian beings are a mixed thing for humanity. So at times they've taught them arts, they taught them language, but they've also been unhealthy for them at times. And they also, harvest humanity. So it's a much more mixed thing. Whereas the Ahrimanic powers are just a pure drain on humanity. So therefore, both of them, if they're confronted correctly, can add to humanity's knowledge. And it's like facing a great challenge. But this whole thing about there's always been stories about Blavatsky, and I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that she's not a perfect person by a long shot, but she's a remarkable adept. And so she brought forward a body of information. And as a woman and as a foreign, Russian woman in America founding theosophy, that's pretty remarkable. So, we have to think about this in an interesting way. It's too easy, I think. And I don't know where somebody like Sagami would get that. It's like he read the surface level of it, but didn't go down a few levels to Lucifer Gnosis, which doesn't read like devil worship at all. You could never get to somewhere like where Blavatsky got with, theosophy and all that impact on people if it was just, some kind of a devil worshiping thing. Like the impact of it is too benevolent. And, I even think some of the worst cases of where things have gone awry with certain people, even in the case of Crowley, it seems to me he started out trying to say, I'm finding the true light, I'm finding love, God, and all that. And that's the weirdness, which is there's a distortion that runs so deep that, we have to be very careful about placing labels on people when you get up at that level. So I would say if somebody identifies themselves as a Satanist, then that's one thing. But no, I mean, it all, what does Satan mean exactly? What exactly are you talking about? So that gets us into an interesting conversation.
Caritas Tarot, eighth sphere. Is there also the danger present that Gaia, Earth itself, could have her soul captured as well?
I think the fundamental piece around the eighth sphere was an incredible gift. And this is another thing that goes right along with the Golden Dawn aspect, if you think about it. So the Golden Dawn, brings forward ceremonial magic, and they bring forward this kind of connection to this Rosicrucian piece. And, they're bringing in the old text, they're translating the old text, and they have Trithemius's incredible steganography doctrine. Now, that is a big revolution in culture because people are going to adopt spirituality and different types of things to it. So, when you think about how it works, about culture and how the impact works, when we go to the eighth sphere, we find again that it's revealed unusually in A.P. Sinnott's work in Esoteric Buddhism, and it's revealed incorrectly. So fundamentally, the eighth sphere, and you can, I recommend the shows that we've done with Gigi Young on this, or Gigi Young's videos on the eighth sphere are quite good. What you want to do is understand it as like a virtual reality realm. So when we are looking ourselves at virtual reality, all the times we can get caught up on things, right? Think of the addiction level that you get on Twitter or something like that with a phone, or video games. That is eighth sphere activity because it's a kind of, it's an unconscious mindlessness. And this is the thing that the Gurdjieff school try to create all these exercises, self-observation exercises, so you wouldn't fall into this eighth sphere trap. So when you're in that unconscious state, you are easy to manipulate as an entity. And so a fantasy world can be created around you and you can get sucked into that eighth sphere. When you're inhabiting the eighth sphere, you are subject to Ahrimanic forces. In Ahrimanic forces, you know, the way that Steiner says is you disappear and the Ahriman takes over. So that's where they're going. Now, in the deep evolutionary process of humanity, the way that Steiner describes it, which I think is quite powerful, is that there's an evolutionary trend that's taking place for humanity where it creates something he calls the warmth of Vulcan, and we get New Jupiter. New Jupiter is like New Jerusalem. It's the new Earth, you know, and it's where humanity is headed. It's a vision for, you know, the future. And so it's spiritual evolution. The advent of the eighth sphere and Ahriman in Steiner's work takes away the evolutionary step for humanity. So the spirituality piece is missed, and you become, instead of going through, you know, in the mystery school mythology, you go through, or cosmology, you go through these various schools of the planets, and then you come back here, and then, you know, maybe you leave the system, whatever it happens to be. But you develop through various planets, and then you come back here and reincarnate, etc. What this does is it locks you into an actual sphere, and so you don't reincarnate through those different planets and come back here. You go into this sphere and then you come back, and so your sensibilities become less and less and less, and your spiritual connection goes out the window, and Ahriman becomes everything. So that's very interesting, and it's so unique in a sense that I would think it would have to have been mystery material. And in fact, Steiner had said that when Sinnett let it out, it was one of the most guarded secrets of the mystery school, because they wanted humanity to talk about the eighth sphere at the right time. And apparently when Sinnett brought it up, wasn't the right time, and he misidentified it, which caused both Blavatsky and Steiner later to come out and correct the record. So there's a lot going on there with that level of knowledge. And I think the question becomes, how does that become applicable on a daily basis? And so mindfulness is probably sort of the short answer, and I gave you the long one. Yes.
Oscar R. Luna. The pyramid of power is managed by black entities. They are the dark side. The power of the darkness rules this planet prison. Stefan Vanderlaan says, is there some truth in it, or is this just hypothetical? Are there demons? And YouTuber 427 says, when things go awry, is it a parasitic influence? Is there a pattern of parasitic impulse manifesting when a school turns from the right hand to the left hand path?
Oh, I think, you know, that makes me think of what Casey said, which is, they said, do discarnate entities impact, you know, living people? And he said, oh yeah, there's thousands about us here at present. So apparently the sense, you know, there's always the sense of wanting expression. And what we get is, you know, we become the vehicles for someone else's expression, the less aware that we are. So that can happen in your day-to-day life. You know, you can have somebody who dominates your life, and, you know, they're kind of living through you. Think of those stage moms and things of this nature, where the person ends up living somebody else's life. But you can take it in the way that somebody like Casey was trying to give it, which is there are entities, there are other things about, and you can become, you know, basically a pawn for those types of things if you don't have your own course well laid out. So I think that that's crucial. A sense of purpose, a sense of direction in life makes a dramatic difference. And so we've seen this happen over and over again. Spiritually, you know, the danger that people get into that I see, and you know, I remember being at an event at Columbia Law School, and they had Ruth Bader Ginsburg was there giving a speech, and I was there with the students and faculty and talking to all these people. And I remember all the conversations, and I can tell you the majority of the conversations from the law students and the business students and everybody was basically about vacation.
Turks and Caicos.
Turks and Caicos, exactly. So this is what they wanted to talk about. This was their obsession, that they wanted to like be pampered on Turks and Caicos. All right, that's cool, and vacation. I'm totally in favor of that. However, you would think with this incredible, education and with all these world problems that they're facing, that there might be, maybe it was just an off night for them, although I spent a few nights with them and didn't find it very compelling. So, I become concerned about society at times when I think these are good people. What's the problem? What happened here? And I'm not thinking I'm good and they're not, but what I'm thinking is that there's something superficial about what they've aspired to, and they're putting tremendous efforts and they're incredibly talented. But, and this reminds me a little bit about the theme of tonight's show with the Golden Dawn. It's all this talent and all this stuff ready to go. And yet, something is creating a subterfuge, and, we're seeing these things go dramatically off in a different direction. So, for me, that was an interesting observation, because I always thought, in those kinds of circles, people were going to bring up a really important case that changed their life, or they were going to talk about society's problems or something else. But the flat, superficial level convinced me that academia is not enough, and that if you don't have something else going in, some direction that's more inner, with an inner purpose, then there's a hollowness to it, that Turks and Caicos will never fix. But I do think Turks and Caicos would be a nice vacation. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Whew, excellent questions tonight here in the Ideas Room. We'll take two more, and I'll read a little something, and then we'll be done for tonight. But what a fantastic time to spend with you, and so many of you here with us tonight. Great questions. Miss Olivia.
Does the cube hand sign, two hands pressed together at the fingertips, have any link to the left or right schools?
How did they say it?
It's like that thing that the celebrities do.
Oh, like the Illuminati. Did she say
Yeah.
Q?
Cube.
Oh, cube.
Making a cube.
I was thinking of our good old friends, Q. Look, there's a series of hand signs that are mystery, hand signals, and all the rest of it. And I learned a good deal of them to try and just figure out the impact that they would have. But if you understand them as language, remember when Gurdjieff goes into the Sarmoon Brotherhood, they show him this thing that looks like a stick figure. And the person goes in, and when they put their hands in different directions, they learn the alphabet of the mystery school. So when they do the movements, the person who's watching them move can read the story that they're telling. So it's like it's almost like an oral tradition for a story, because the schools understand that records get burned or altered. As we see now, things get digitally altered, even when there's an archive on the internet. So, that's George Orwell put that very nicely with the whole, he who controls the past controls the future. So, they obviously want to be able to control what people see and what they know about the past. So, ultimately, these schools, when they meet with each other, so if I'm walking into like Congress or something like that and I get a handshake, the schools that they're involved with, they know the handshake, and they know that, you are on their team because of the handshake and all the rest of it. So there's tons of that. Society is honeycombed with those signals. And, I would never walk around looking for that stuff, because it would drive you crazy, just like steganography. However, you can learn to read it in important situations. And that, I think, is worthwhile. So in general, I feel like, developing those abilities to understand the signs and the symbols. As for any particular sign that somebody makes, like we see Illuminati symbols, but
You've been accused of doing weird things like that.
I just use my hands a lot. That's what happens. What I will say is this, when something becomes so cliche and they try to they're like, oh yeah, that person is making an Illuminati signal or whatever, it's spun itself out, and you have to be careful, I think, when you're dealing in independent research as well. One of the things is to keep a kind of discipline about things, not to get fascinated, making fun of celebrities, for example, not to get too fascinated making fun of politicians. If it's a tricky thing, because think about Twitter or something like that, literally, where they'll just go after a particular figure. And even if you don't like them, at a certain point, you wonder to yourself, I'm not even sure this is beneficial, even though I'm against that person, because I don't like the idea that I'm being fed stuff that should, reinforce, so that's also a different kind of programming. That's basically so much of what Elon Musk, the whole approach with Elon Musk is right now, which is to give so many of those people what they want to hear. But, he comes out of a milieu that doesn't support what he says. So you can, my thing about Elon Musk is I can support what he says, but I don't support who he is. And I think that that's an important differentiation. But the hand signs, I mean, all of the symbolisms are fascinating, including the fact that in very interesting rituals, there's all kinds of X hand signs. And when I studied with the Gurdjieff schools, because I was interested to study with them, I learned a great deal of their movements, in fact. And I think what I remember distinctly is when you learn those movements, your relationship to time is a little bit different somehow. Maybe it's just because you're a little more awake.
Last question.
Yes.
Okay. Chris Radzian, I may have missed it, but can you talk about Aiwass and Lamb, the entities Crowley communicated with?
Wow. Well, that's so interesting. Here's the upshot is the episode was about Golden Dawn tonight. There's a Crowley section. But it's true that what happens with him is that after he breaks away from Golden Dawn, he starts his own thing, and it's a triad. And then that becomes Thelema and all that. And what's interesting is some of the top people in esoteric literature will take his writings and say, well, he knows this and he knows that, he's got this right, he's got that right, and he does. But the problem was the distortion of him as an individual. But when he goes to Egypt, I had that picture of him with his wife, but she's very interesting and she has a lot of clairvoyant abilities. And when she's in Egypt, she starts saying, they're waiting to talk to you. They're waiting to talk to you. And he's like, what are you talking about? And she said, Horus is going to talk to you, the Egyptian god. And so she gets this message, and then he has an incredible experience while he's there where a being dictates the entire, his entire book of the law to him. And it's, this is him getting this information and being used as this channel. He's a great channel for this. But the being later he'll learn is Aiwass. And Aiwass is fascinating for a lot of reasons. But basically, he's basically identified with Lucifer. He thinks he's meeting Lucifer. And so there's a great mixed bag of learning and distortion, I think, with Crowley. And in terms of Lamb, Lamb's quite fascinating too, because whenever we get around Crowley, there seems to be these UFO pieces, and Lamb looks very much like a gray entity. And in a way, by Crowley putting that out there, we get the great benefit of trying to connect these up later, because you get that large-headed beings. Well, what is with the large-headed beings? It's interesting because it seems that they exist both on this weird, almost transhumanist, esoteric, occult side, and also when you think about Akhenaten and Akhenaten's family and the way that they're depicted with the incredibly oblong heads, there's something maybe that takes place, whether you're on the right path or the left path when you're expanding those abilities. And, obviously the shape of the head of Akhenaten is not a normal human head. So something very deep has taken place there. In terms of the Greys heads, it's weird. What you're reminding me about is if you really go in and read the story and look at the sculpture of Betty Hill, of the being that she dealt with, who she called Junior, it doesn't actually look like a Grey. It has eyes, for one. And it doesn't have a nose, but it looks a lot more human than the Greys do. So I find that interesting. Now, since you got me rolling on this, I'm going to give you a little mind blower teaser for an episode we have coming up on the Cosmos Club. Now, some of you may recount the fact that when we did a Cosmos Club episode last summer, that the Cosmos Club leader, Jerome Powell, who founded it, he was stationed in Cape Girardeau, and he lived there for a decade during the Civil War and after. And then he went all around the world of America, the American world, Grand Canyon, discovered all these different things and had all these remarkable experiences, founded the Cosmos Club. And it became such a center of activity that I call it UFO Bilderberg by the time we get into the 50s and 60s. But here's what's very, very strange. If you remember that there's a guy out there on the UFO side named Charles Hall, and he was basically a male guy and, kind of a sergeant who was doing this, working at not Area 51, but Area 52. And that he claimed that in a series of books, the Millennial Hospitality books, that these tall whites were interacting and were hanging out there, and that they had families and that they had been there. One of the things I found interesting about his stories was that he said, well, what's interesting is one of them, these groups, came here during the time of George Washington and have lived here ever since. So I think there's a very odd connection with the fact that the founder of the Cosmos Club lived in Cape Girardeau, where there'd be the first major UFO crash landing with bodies and all that in 1941, before Roswell, before Maury Island, before Trinity. And then all the strangeness about him and the cosmos. He's studying things and naming them after stars, and studying with Native Americans there about star people. So I think that this is going to maybe pay off in some deep realization. So I guess it's you call that a qualified teaser for the next episode. But with that in mind, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Are we all done, or do you want
We
one
are
more
done.
question? We're done. Okay, I've got a lot of people to thank.
Thank you.
Starting with Eurythmia's Fun, Leonard Murphy, Brian Paget, Catherine Rorden, Robert Scott, Flora A, Izzy the Great, Bill Mayo, Mark Lane, Norman Smith. I will get this one day. Clifton Frodolfer, Daryl Dothrow, Just a Girl, Sun Hero, Joe Dirt, Wait a Minute 72, Occult Fan, Doreen Hewitt, Ms. Ruby, Chiron Drum, Karen Carpenter, Erica Swenson Elliott, Stefan Vanderlaan, UFO Hunters, Savage Legend, YouTuber 427, Melody Lenz, and Gil and Joy R. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Unbelievable. Wow, we really appreciate it. Your support helps us do the things we do here. To all our supporters and subscribers, thank you. You really kind of give us that extra inspiration at our back. We will be back with you next week. And before I go, a couple of shout outs for everybody. And oh, yes, the ultimate highlighting of the comments here. There's more on the Golden Dawn on the way, because I found something that might give us an idea of the most modern day version of Golden Dawn, shall we say. Thank you, Robert Devine. Excellent. Vase of Flowers. That's an interesting name. Great show and much love. Leslie Donnelly. Thank you so much, Leslie. Steiner to God. Shout out. There he is. Najat Madre. Gigi, it's great to see you out there.
Mhm.
You're brilliant. Everyone has to check out Gigi's latest show. It's unbelievable. Gigi Young on YouTube. Check out that last episode. And we know we're getting deep when Gigi deals with Blavatsky and such. Yes. Occult fan, he's out there. Lori D. Traveling Riverside Blues. Skinny Deform. That's an interesting one. Bo Rip. Thank you very much. Wow.
Can I throw you something
Sure.
on the way out? Okay, so I didn't get to ask this question. A cult fan says, please ask DJ if he knows of the alchemical novel The Red Lion. It's very helpful in fighting the dark schools / Black Lodge.
Yes, that is a really interesting one. I don't remember the details on it right now, but I have read it. Thomas Ball, thank you, but that's a great suggestion, and I think people should read that one. I know Kate's out there. It's great to see you. Bill Ferry, sir, thanks for coming. There's Gigi, of course. Brilliant show. Thank you. It's great. Golden Dawn's important because we spend a lot of time on anthroposophy and theosophy because of the impact there. Golden Dawn makes the impact, but it gets diverted. And in such a way by really notorious people. I mean, there's something that happens I didn't even go into where in 1901, this couple from Washington go there and fool Mathers. And for some reason, he's almost under some kind of psychic control. And they have him give them some secret Golden Dawn documents. And then they go back to London and pretend they are, the Golden Dawn shizzle. And they do all kinds of notorious activity and end up getting arrested. And the guy gets arrested for rape. And, they get arrested for, all kinds of financial shenanigans. And they're pushing this whole thing about being vegetarians and people see them eating meat and stuff, they really had the thing down. And Mathers is freaking out. He's like, I don't know how this happened, but like they have access to my documents and they're running away with the whole Golden Dawn thing. And it is in fact that group that takes down, because of all the public stuff that happens. It's that group that takes down our friends at the Golden Dawn. I grew up with Gurdjieff and Ouspensky, so muchly helped tonight. Well, they're so fascinating and there's so much there, I think, that we can learn from Gurdjieff's tradition. And it's interesting, of course, Ouspensky, although they called his book on Gurdjieff In Search of the Miraculous, his actual title for the book was Fragments of an Unknown Teaching. That's really what it is. It is a fragment of something quite remarkable. And I think he knew, which is why he hung in there, although Gurdjieff was incredibly hard to deal with. Steiner is worth returning to. He had it, but energy still stolen. Yes. Corky Goss, you got it. That's really true. Don Neway, it's great to see you. Karen Carpenter, thank you. Keep up the great work. Wow. Sun Hero, I like it. Stefan, Gigi Abilene, just fantastic group here tonight. We will see you all next week, and we're keeping an eye on the Chinese balloon surprise floating around.
Bill Ferry said earlier, Malachi Martin's warning was to look at the sky.
Well, gee, you can take that in a few different ways. I think there is something up with what they're doing with that. And if you note that they're trying to start the year off with this, it's a very unhealthy development. And, as I said at the very beginning, the whole thing is against any kind of military protocol. So they're not telling us what it's all about.
It's also right after Davos.
True.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Caritas. Fantastic. Yeah, let's think about that. We may have some special reports coming up for you between now and Friday, but we have great interviews coming up for you as well. As I mentioned, Gigi Young, Joseph Farrell, Catherine Austin Fitz. The list is really powerful. So it's a packed house of all-stars. And of course, Miss Olivia, bravo.
Thank
Nicely
you.
done. Round of applause, everyone.
We didn't get to it, But a cult fan wanted to remind you, don't forget Ozzy wrote Mr. Crowley,
Well, that's true. Well,
which is a great song.
oh, there's a lot of salutes to Crowley and culture. That's a good point. There's a line in a Bowie song that says, I'm closer to the golden dawn immersed in Crowley's uniform.
What song is that?
That's on Hunky Dory. It's Quicksand.
On that Bowie note,
Yeah.
let me find it. It's really good. It's about Word on a Wing
Yes.
and why he wrote that. Rochelle Waters. Bowie mentions he got into some dark stuff on the set of Man Who Fell to Earth. That's where he got into Christianity. He was earnest when he wrote Word on a Wing, said it was for protection.
No question. Well, he wore a cross at all times. You know, he knew. He also, I have a great story about Bowie, but I'm going to save it for a Bowie episode that's going to be coming up. So you heard it here first. You already heard that our good friend Elvis was in Roswell when he started out. That's kind of interesting, folks. Let's face it. Johann Wolf, Blue Water. Wow, great. A great crowd out there tonight. Thank you, everyone. Just amazing. And we'll spend more time with the Golden Dawn and opening up this subject, which I find absolutely fascinating. And the people involved, you know, for all their different stripes and all the rest of it, just really incredible people. Again, I relate very much to the drive that they had to do something with the culture, to move it in a different direction. So in that sense, I think we all have something in common with Golden Dawn. But hey, every time you pick up a tarot card or whatever, remember, it was the Golden Dawn that got us rolling on that. We'll see you all next week and have a great night, everyone. You know, it says end broadcast, but after all,
Never really ends.
it never really ends, does it? Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
God bless.